It is one of the most widespread and recognizable religious symbols in the world. The anguished figure of a man, naked but for a loincloth and crown of thorns, hands and feet brutally nailed to a wooden cross. The Crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth in 33 CE is perhaps the single most famous and consequential act of capital punishment, spawning the world's largest religion and forever changing the course of human history. Yet despite its sheer ubiquity in Christian iconography, there is something rather abstract about the practice of crucifixion, for unlike in other forms of execution such as hanging or beheading, the cause of death is not immediately obvious. Does the victim simply die of thirst and exposure, or is some other mechanism at play? And who first came up with this cruel and agonizing form of punishment? Well, let's find out as we dive into the strange and barbaric history of crucifixion. Though the exact person to think up crucifixion is unknown, it is thought to have originated with the ancient Assyrians and Babylonians, who likely developed it from the even older, pleasant practice of impalement. One of the earliest written descriptions of crucifixion comes from Greek historian Herodotus, who recounted an incident from the reign of Persian Emperor Darius I. In 519 BCE, the neighboring monarch named Aracha declared himself Emperor Nebuchadnezzar IV and captured the key city of Babylon just outside of modern-day Baghdad in Iraq. In response, Darius sent his top general, Intophrines, to recapture the city. When Babylon fell with little resistance, Darius had Aracha and 3,000 of his followers crucified for their defiance. From Mesopotamia to Persia, the practice spread across the Mediterranean, likely carried by Alexander the Great during his wars of conquest. To varying extents, crucifixion was practiced by the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Phoenicians, though the most prolific early practitioners were the Carthaginians, Phoenicians who settled in what is now Tunisia in northern Africa. The Carthaginians used crucifixion not only as a punishment, but also as a form of ritual sacrifice. For example, 6th century BCE general Malchus crucified his own son Catalo to the god Baal in return for military victory. And during the Second Punic War of 218 to 201 BCE, Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca crucified 500 Roman soldiers captured in battle. This act likely inspired the Romans to adopt crucifixion for themselves because, sure, why not? Indeed, while the Romans may not have invented crucifixion, they arguably perfected it, turning it into a truly horrific and degrading form of punishment reserved for only the lowest of the low in Roman society, such as slaves, foreigners, Christians, and political agitators. So degrading, in fact, that anyone who could prove Roman citizenship could opt for a different form of capital punishment, such as beheading. And according to writer and philosopher Cicero, it was even considered unacceptable to present a Roman citizen with the mere image of a cross. Aside from the execution of Jesus, and note, after this video, do watch our video, is there any actual hard evidence Jesus existed, perhaps the most famous act of crucifixion took place in 71 BCE in the wake of the Third Servile War, when 100,000 slaves, led by the gladiator Spartacus, rebelled against the Roman government. Following the uprising's defeat at the hand of Marcus Licinius Crassus and his legions, some 6,000 rebels were crucified along the Appian Way as a dire warning to any future would-be insurrectionists. However, crucifixion was seldom used in Rome itself, the practice being far more widespread in the outer fringes of the empire. For example, thousands of Jews, including Jesus, were crucified in Roman Judea between 6 and 132 CE, while hundreds of participants in British Queen Boudicca's failed uprising in 60 CE were executed in this manner. Rome's enemies also often adopted this practice, with Germanic tribesmen crucifying dozens of Roman tax collectors in AD 28 as an act of defiance. In the early days of Roman crucifixion, the condemned was simply hung from a tree or plain vertical pole called a crux simplex and left to die of exposure and dehydration. Over time, however, the Romans developed an elaborate ritual designed to inflict upon the victim the maximum amount of pain, suffering, and humiliation. Indeed, the modern word excruciating comes from the Latin ex crucio, from the cross. First, the victim was stripped naked, save for a loincloth, and scourged across the back, buttocks, and upper legs with a whip known as a flagellum or flagrum, whose leather thongs were fitted with metal balls and bone tips to inflict even greater damage. Only a few classes of citizens were spared this initial punishment, including women, senators, and soldiers, though not in the latter case for the crime of desertion. On some occasions, the victim would be subjected to further mutilations, such as having their tongue or eyes cut out. The victim would then be forced to carry the implement of their demise to the site of execution, their path lined with jeering onlookers for maximum humiliation. Unlike what is usually depicted in the Christian art, however, the victim would not carry the entire cross, but rather just the crossbar or patibulum, the vertical post being permanently fixed in the ground and reused for multiple crucifixions. Nonetheless, this would have weighed up to 60 kilograms, quite the burden for the already weakened victim. Ever creative, the Romans actually developed several different styles of crosses, with the familiar T-shaped tau or Latin cross being known as the crux immissa. There was also the crux commissure, which was Y-shaped, and the crux decussator, which was X-shaped. There were also standard heights of crosses, the shorter model known as the crux sublimes, and the even shorter, the crux humilis. Arriving at the site of execution, the victim would then be tied and often nailed to the patibulum before being hoisted onto the stipes. Here again, the traditional Christian depictions of crucifixion are slightly inaccurate, for nails driven through the palm would be too easy to be torn out by the victim's weight. Instead, the nails were driven through the much stronger tissue and bones of the wrist. Once suspended from the cross, the victim's buttocks would often be supported by a simple wooden seat known as a sedile or sidicula, and less frequently their feet by a block known as a suppendanum. If the feet were nailed to the cross, this would be done through the bones of the heel, which would not only prevent the nails from tearing free, but also inflict even more agony. Finally, a wooden panel called a titulus would be affixed to the cross, inscribed with the victim's name and the nature of their crime. In the case of Jesus, the titulus famously bore the words Lessus Nazarenus Rex Luderium, Jesus, the Nazarene King of the Jews. And as in the case of Jesus, crucifixions were seldom carried out alone, with the Romans typically grouping several victims together as a form of spectacle. A contingent of soldiers was also posted at the execution site, forbidden to leave their posts until the condemned had breathed their last. Death by crucifixion usually took between 2 and 3 days, though this was often hastened by the attending soldiers for obvious reasons. Common methods of accelerating death included breaking the victim's legs, a practice known as crurifragium, stabbing them in the chest with a spear, striking a hard blow to the chest, or lighting a smoky fire beneath the cross to asphyxiate them. But absent such interventions, how do victims of crucifixion actually die? The answer is complicated, as there are many potential mechanisms at work here. Firstly, the scouring inflicted prior to crucifixion, in addition to the nails driven through the hands and feet, would have resulted in significant blood loss and hypovolemic shock. This, combined with severe dehydration from being exposed to the elements without water, would be enough to kill the victim within a day or two. However, there was another, more insidious process at work. Suspension in this way would cause the victim's body weight to push down on the diaphragm, making it very difficult for them to breathe out. With their shoulders likely dislocated, the only way for the victim to gain any reprieve would be to push up against their feet to relieve the pressure on their chest. But as the hours wore on, the victim would become ever more exhausted until they finally became too weak to support themselves. And even this small reprieve was only possible if the victim's feet were nailed to the cross or supported by a suppendanum. If their legs were unsupported or broken, there was no way to delay what happened next. Unable to exhale, the victim's lungs and consequently their bloodstream would quickly become saturated with carbon dioxide, triggering an excruciating urge to breathe and causing the heart to beat faster to circulate the remaining oxygen around the body. Meanwhile, rising carbonic acid in the blood would begin to damage the capillaries, causing them to leak plasma and leading to a buildup of fluid around the heart and lungs, aka pericardial and pleural effusion. Indeed, the Gospels claim that when the Roman soldier Longinus pierced Jesus' side with a spear to ensure he was dead, the wound oozed both blood and water, a phenomenon consistent with such a fluid buildup. Eventually, the combination of respiratory collapse and hypovolemic shock would cause the heart to fail, leading to death by cardiac arrest. The speed at which these effects set in is attested to by experiments performed by German radiologist Hermann Modder, who in the 1940s hung volunteer medical students from crosses, mercifully with leather straps instead of nails, and monitored their vital signs. Within only 6 minutes, the students' tidal volume, that is, the volume of air moved in and out of their lungs, decreased by 70%, while their blood pressure halved and their heart rate doubled. And within 12 minutes, they began to pass out. If, on the other hand, the students were allowed to support their weight for 20 seconds at a time, their condition improved significantly. And, well, you thought your university program was torture. Though the experiments only lasted 30 to 40 minutes due to wrist pain, Modder concluded that the average crucifixion victim would only last 3 to 6 hours before suffering complete cardiopulmonary collapse. This suggests that supports like the sedile and suppendanum were deliberately added to prolong the victim's suffering, and explains why the breaking of legs so swiftly led to death. Alternatively, the breaking of large bones like the femur could have induced massive internal bleeding or fat embolization, that is, the release of fat globules from the bone marrow into the blood, which could block blood vessels and lead to cardiac arrest. Yet this would likely have been little comfort for the average crucifixion victim, for the agonizing combination of dislocated shoulders, nails driven through the wrist and ankles, deep wounds from flagellation, and severe dehydration would have made even 6 hours seem like weeks. Occasionally, the Romans would crucify victims upside down, as in the case of Jesus' disciple, St. Peter. While this was considered by far the most degrading form of crucifixion, mercifully the blood flow to the victim's head would quickly lead to unconsciousness, making the whole ordeal less physically if not socially excruciating. After more than 500 years of refinement and use, crucifixion was finally abolished in Rome in 350 CE by Constantine, the first Christian emperor. However, crucifixion continued to be practiced intermittently over the next 2 millennia, with France in the Middle Ages often reserving the punishment for Jews and heretics. Crucifixion was also used in feudal Japan into the early 19th century, though with a twist. Once the victims were fixed to the cross, the executioner would strategically shoot arrows at them to inflict a slow, agonizing death. Such is the brutality and humiliation associated with crucifixion that cases of the practice in modern times seldom fail to shock and enrage. For instance, in April 1915, it was reported that a Canadian soldier had been found near the Belgian town of Ypres, crucified to barn doors with German bayonets. The incident caused outrage in Canada and the other Entente powers and was seized upon by propagandists as evidence of German barbarism and depravity. Despite this, however, no concrete evidence of this incident has ever been found, meaning it was likely just a battlefield rumor or a deliberately crafted piece of black propaganda. In more recent years, crucifixion has been carried out by Islamic militant groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL in Sudan and Iraq, and by the Saudi Arabian government, though in the latter case it is used as a form of gibbeting, in which the victim first is executed by beheading before having their body displayed on a cross as a warning to others. Yet despite its apparent ubiquity, surprisingly little physical evidence remains of crucifixion in biblical times. This is likely due to the fact that crucifixion victims were usually cremated after execution, leaving few remains. However, in June 1968, construction workers in Jerusalem accidentally unearthed a number of tombs dating from the 1st century CE. Of the skeletons discovered in the tomb, one, identified as Yehohanan, son of Chagal, had a large nail driven through its heel bones, the first concrete evidence of Roman crucifixion ever discovered. What's more, the skeleton revealed hitherto unknown details of Roman crucifixion methods. For example, no evidence was found of nails being driven through the wrists, indicating that Yehohanan was simply tied to the cross with ropes or leather thongs. Also, both heels showed evidence of penetration, leading archaeologists to speculate that Yehohanan's feet had been nailed together to the cross in an awkward and likely very painful bent-leg posture. However, it was later realized that the nail discovered with the skeleton was too short to have penetrated both feet and the cross, meaning Yehohanan's feet were instead nailed to either side of the stripes or upright. Still, much remains unknown about this ancient practice, for since 1968, only 3 other skeletons have been unearthed showing possible signs of crucifixion: one in Mendes, Egypt, one in Lalada, Italy, and one in Cambridgeshire in England. At 6:45 a.m. on March 1st, 1954, a blinding flash brighter than the sun lit up the sky above Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. From an observation bunker on Enu Island, 30 kilometers away, scientists watched as a monstrous, glowing fireball rose above the lagoon, expanding to more than 7 kilometers in diameter. Within a minute, this fireball had grown into a towering mushroom cloud stretching 11 kilometers into the stratosphere. Codenamed Castle Bravo, the blast marked history's first test of a practical hydrogen bomb and ushered the Cold War into a terrifying new era. Thousands of times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, hydrogen bombs gave humanity the means to obliterate entire cities and perhaps even end all life on Earth. But what is a hydrogen bomb anyway? How are they developed? And what makes them so apocalyptically destructive? Well, climb down into your fallout shelter and put on your radiation suit as we dive into the history and physics of the most terrifying weapon of mass destruction ever created. While ordinary nuclear weapons are based on the process of fission, the splitting apart of heavy uranium or plutonium atoms, hydrogen bombs, more correctly known as thermonuclear weapons, exploit the process of fusion, combining lighter hydrogen atoms to form heavier helium atoms. As hydrogen atoms normally repel each other due to electrostatic forces, fusion requires extremely high temperatures and pressures to bring the atoms close enough for the attractive, strong nuclear force to overcome this repulsion and bind the atomic nuclei together. Such conditions are found in the cores of stars, and indeed it is the fusion of hydrogen which keeps them giving off their extreme energy. The process of stellar nuclear synthesis was first worked out in 1937 by German physicist Hans Bethe, who would later play a key role in the Manhattan Project, the wartime effort to develop the first atomic bomb. However, it was one of Bethe's colleagues, Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, who first proposed in September 1941 that a nuclear fission reaction could be used to trigger nuclear fusion and release even greater amounts of energy. This reaction, however, would be different from the light hydrogen fusion found in stars, which is far too slow and requires too much energy to make an effective weapon. Instead, Fermi proposed using the heavy hydrogen isotopes deuterium and tritium, which require less energy to fuse. The easiest fusion reaction to initiate involves the combination of one deuterium and one tritium atom to produce one atom of helium-4, one free neutron, and 17.6 mega-electron volts of energy. The next easiest reaction combines two deuterium atoms to produce one helium-3 atom, one neutron, and 3.268 mega-electron volts of energy. The main advantage of fusion is the significant increase in weapon yield and efficiency that it allows. While regular fission weapons are extraordinarily powerful, there is an upper limit to their explosive yield. This is because there is only a limited period during which the fuel in a weapon's core can undergo fission and be converted into energy before said energy blows the core apart and halts the reaction. While there are several methods for increasing pure fission yield, such as using a larger core, surrounding the core with a heavy lead or uranium shell, or tamper to delay its scattering, or using a neutron source to increase the number of fissions, eventually the weapon becomes too heavy or uses too much costly fuel to be practical. Therefore, the upper limit for pure fission devices is around 700 kilotons. However, not only does fission produce far more energy per unit mass of fuel than fission, but it also generates large numbers of neutrons, which can be directed into the trigger weapon's core to boost the fission process and release even more energy. This makes the theoretical yield of fusion weapons effectively limitless. The idea of using fusion to create weapons of nearly limitless power immediately captured the attention of Fermi's colleague, Hungarian physicist Edward Teller. Although such a weapon would require a regular and as yet unproven fission weapon to trigger the fusion reaction, Teller dismissed fission as a mere matter of engineering and saw the fusion bomb, which he dubbed the Super, a far more interesting theoretical problem. Indeed, such was Teller's obsession that he began neglecting his actual assigned duties on the Manhattan Project, leading project director J. Robert Oppenheimer to reassign much of his work to others. Yet while fusion was a low priority compared to fission, Oppenheimer nonetheless allowed Teller to spend much of his time studying the Super. However, following the end of the Second World War and the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many nuclear scientists began to question whether the Super, if it was feasible, should actually be developed. Some, like Oppenheimer, Bethe, Fermi, and the Atomic Energy Commission chair David Lilienthal, argued that the Super would be too powerful for use against military targets and could thus only be used against civilian populations. As Fermi and physicist Isidore Rabi wrote in 1949, a decision on the proposal that an all-out effort be undertaken for the development of the Super cannot, in our opinion, be separated from considerations of broad national policy. Necessarily, such a weapon goes far beyond any military objective and enters the range of very great natural catastrophes. By its very nature, it cannot be confined to a military objective, but becomes a weapon which in practical effect is almost one of genocide. The fact that no limits exist on the destructiveness of this weapon makes its very existence, and the knowledge of its construction, a danger to humanity as a whole. It is necessarily an evil thing considered in any light. Oppenheimer further emphasized the potentially high cost of developing and building superbombs, arguing that building a large stockpile of smaller tactical fission weapons was a better use of the nation's resources. On the other side of the debate, Edward Teller, along with Ernest Lawrence, Luis Alvarez, and others, argued that the development of the Super was inevitable, and that if the United States did not develop it first, then the Soviet Union would. As Teller wrote to Fermi in 1945, "If the development of the Super is possible, it is out of our powers to prevent it. All we can do is retard its completion by some years. That any form of international control may be put on a more stable basis by the knowledge of the full extent of the problem that must be solved and of the dangers of a ruthless international competition." The debate raged on until August the 29th, 1949, when the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb 5 years ahead of Western predictions. This feat, aided in great part by a network of Soviet spies within the Manhattan Project, shattered the United States' comfortable nuclear monopoly and sent shockwaves through the defense establishment. A month later, on October the 29th, the Atomic Energy Commission convened a special committee of scientists to draw up recommendations regarding the development of the Super. The committee's report, released the following day, concluded that although the members of the advisory committee are not unanimous in their proposals as to what should be done with regard to the superbomb, there are certain elements of unanimity among us. We all hope that by one means or another the development of these weapons can be avoided. We are all reluctant to see the United States take the initiative in precipitating this development. We are all agreed that it would be wrong at the present moment to commit ourselves to an all-out effort towards its development. But to the dismay of the anti-super camp, the die was already cast. Not wanting to fall behind the Soviets in the nuclear arms race, on January the 31st, 1950, US President Harry S. Truman officially ordered the development of the hydrogen bomb. Unfortunately, the problem of initiating fusion proved far more difficult than anyone could have imagined. In Enrico Fermi and Edward Teller's original conception of the hydrogen bomb, known as the classical super, deuterium or tritium fusion fuel was either wrapped around the core of a regular fission weapon or layered within it, a configuration Teller dubbed the alarm clock. Teller believed that the tremendous heat produced by the fission reaction would be sufficient to set off a fusion reaction within the fuel. But as Teller's wartime calculations quickly revealed, this was not the case. The major problem Teller discovered was that around 80% of the energy released by detonating a nuclear bomb is in the form of X-rays, to which hydrogen is nearly transparent. This means that almost none of this energy will be absorbed by the fusion fuel. The remaining 20% is in the form of kinetic energy, contained within electrons, neutrons, and other subatomic particles. However, generating enough of this energy to initiate fusion requires an extremely large fission bomb in the 100 kilotons range and an even larger mass of fusion fuel, creating a weapon so large and so heavy, as Robert Oppenheimer jokes, that it could only be delivered by ox cart. And even if a fusion reaction can be initiated, Teller's calculations revealed that it cannot be sustained for long enough to generate a useful explosive yield. The problem is that successful fusion requires a certain fuel density and temperature. However, the higher the temperature of the fuel, the more forcefully it expands and the harder it becomes to compress. And once the reaction begins, the energy released heats the fuel and causes it to expand, reducing its density and halting the reaction. Thus, in order to initiate a successful fusion reaction, the fuel must be compressed to the proper density before it is heated. Unfortunately, the kinetic shockwave from the fission detonation is neither powerful nor fast enough to accomplish this. Even worse, the thermal energy generated by the compression of the fuel escapes the weapon at the same rate as it is added, meaning the fuel never accumulates enough energy to ignite a fusion reaction. Now, of course, all of this assumes that the fusion fuel is composed entirely of deuterium. However, adding tritium to the mix significantly improves the situation since, as previously mentioned, the deuterium-tritium fusion reaction requires the least amount of energy to initiate and is 100 times faster than the deuterium-deuterium reaction. But this creates an entirely different problem, since not only is tritium expensive to produce, being generated in small quantities in nuclear reactors, but it is also radioactive, decaying with a half-life of 12.3 years. As a result, incorporating enough tritium into a classical super to make it feasible would make such a weapon prohibitively expensive. The tritium would also need to be constantly topped up as it decays away in storage. One way around this is to breed tritium with the bomb itself. This is done by using the isotope lithium-6 in the form of lithium deuteride as the fusion fuel. When lithium-6 absorbs a neutron from the fission reaction, it splits into an atom of helium-4 and an atom of tritium, which can then be burned along with the deuterium. But while this solves the storage problem, it is hardly an ideal solution, for it is far more efficient to use the neutrons from the trigger's detonation to breed plutonium from uranium, a much more efficient and energetic process than breeding tritium. No matter what Teller and others tried, the super appeared, for all intents and purposes, to be impossible. Then, after years of fruitless calculations and endless dead ends, in 1951, Teller sought the advice of Polish mathematician Stanislaw Ulam, who immediately made a key insight. Within just a few months, the pair presented their groundbreaking solution to the super problem in a paper titled On Heterocatalytic Detonations, Hydrodynamic Lenses and Radiation Mirrors. Teller and Ulam's breakthrough was the principle of radiation implosion, wherein X-rays, rather than heat or shock waves, are used to compress and ignite the fusion fuel. Their bomb design, known to this day as the Teller-Ulam design, consists of two main parts: the primary stage, or trigger, comprising an ordinary fission weapon, and a secondary stage containing the fusion fuel. The second stage consists of a cylindrical metal canister called the radiation case, within which sits a thick cylindrical layer of natural uranium known as a pusher or tamper. Inside this is a layer of polystyrene foam, and inside this the fusion fuel. And finally, running down the center of the secondary is a cylindrical plutonium rod known as the spark plug. When the primary stage detonates, the X-rays produced are channeled through an interstage into the radiation case, where they are absorbed by the tamper. This heats the outside surface of the tamper to extremely high temperatures, causing that surface to rapidly slough off or ablate. The rapid outwards expansion of this ablated material induces an equal and opposite reaction that causes the tamper to collapse inwards, compressing the fusion fuel. However, due to its relatively large mass, the tamper acts as a thermal barrier, preventing the fuel from being heated too rapidly and allowing it to be compressed to critical density before ignition. At the same time, rapid heating converts the polystyrene foam into a hot hydrocarbon plasma. This serves two main functions. First, the plasma prevents the inside surface of the tamper from ablating, which would create an outward reactive force that could prematurely blow the second stage apart. Second, the plasma, being transparent to X-rays, maintains an open channel for X-rays streaming in from the primary stage. The implosion of the tamper not only compresses the fusion fuel, but also the spark plug, which soon reaches criticality and undergoes a nuclear chain reaction. This suddenly increases the temperature inside the secondary stage to around 300 million Kelvin, triggering a fusion reaction in the now compressed fuel. This fusion reaction, in turn, releases a large burst of neutrons, further boosting the fission rate of both the spark plug and the tamper, and creating a positive feedback loop that releases enormous amounts of energy. Eventually, the outward pressure generated by the fusing fuel overcomes the inward momentum of the collapsing tamper, and the secondary detonates. The genius of Teller and Elam's design lies in the harnessing of X-rays, which, as previously mentioned, make up 80% of the energy released by the primary stage. As X-rays travel at the speed of light, they can trigger fusion sooner and sustain it for longer than either the heat or the shockwave from the primary. But while this is impressive enough on its own, there is another, even more terrifying advantage to the Teller-Elam design. While the basic design only includes a single fusion stage, if a second fusion stage of identical construction is placed next to the first, the X-rays produced by the first fusion stage will trigger the same radiation implosion process in the second, releasing even more energy. Indeed, while no practical thermonuclear weapon has ever used more than 3 stages, one could theoretically stack any number of fusion stages together, making the explosive yield of the Teller-Elam design effectively limitless. While this design is traditionally credited to both Teller and Elam, there is considerable debate as to which man contributed what. Some, like weapons designer Ted Taylor, credited Elam with developing the key principles of radiation implosion, arguing that Teller would not have gotten far without his help. Teller, on the other hand, being prone to self-aggrandizement and eager to be seen as the father of the atomic bomb, took full credit for the breakthrough, stating in a 1999 interview with Scientific American that, quote, "I contributed, Elam did not. I'm sorry I had to answer it in this abrupt way. Elam was rightly dissatisfied with an old approach. He came to me with part of an idea which I had already worked out and had difficulty getting people to listen to. He was willing to sign a paper. When it then came to defending that paper and really putting work into it, he refused. He said, 'I don't believe in it.'" Whatever the case may be, the first full-scale tests of Teller and Elam's ideas took place in the spring of 1951 as part of Operation Greenhouse, conducted at Enowatak Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The third nuclear device of the series, codenamed George, comprised a ring-shaped fission weapon with a capsule of gaseous deuterium-tritium fusion fuel placed in its center. Detonated at 8:30 p.m. on May 8, 1951, Greenhouse George had a yield of 225 kilotons, significantly greater than the trigger, but still far below the potential yield of a true thermonuclear weapon. Indeed, most of George's extra yield came not from the fusion itself, but the flurry of neutrons it produced, which boosted the fission process within the trigger's core. The fourth and final test in the series, codenamed Item, would exploit this effect more fully by injecting a small amount of deuterium-tritium gas into the core of a conventional nuclear weapon just prior to detonation. This resulted in an explosive yield of 45.5 kilotons, about twice that of the original fission weapon. Such fission boosting is still used today and is a useful method for enhancing the yield of smaller nuclear weapons. With the basic principles now fully understood, scientists were now ready to conduct a full-scale test of the Teller-Elam design, codenamed Ivy Mike. As the technology for producing sufficient pure lithium deuteride had not yet been fully perfected, it was decided to use pure liquid deuterium as the fusion fuel. This also simplified the fusion reaction from a physics standpoint, allowing the design to be more easily analyzed. However, as hydrogen liquefies at 20 Kelvin or minus 253 degrees Celsius, this design required the construction of a massive 3,000 kilowatt refrigeration plant and a 50-ton, 1,000-liter dewar, essentially a giant thermos flask to cool and store the cryogenic deuterium. This, along with the test weapon itself, was installed in a 2-story corrugated aluminium building known as a shot cab located on the island of Ugalab at Enowatak Atoll. More a laboratory experiment than the practical weapon, the Mike device was derisively dubbed a thermonuclear installation by Soviet scientists. To gather vital data from the test, dozens of cameras and other instruments were arranged around Enowatak Atoll. This included an aluminium-coated plywood tunnel filled with helium balloons which stretched 2.7 kilometers along an artificial coral causeway from the shot cab to an unmanned observation station on Bogan Island. Known as a Krauss-Ogle box, the device provided a free path for the X-rays, gamma rays, and neutrons from the blast to travel to scientific instruments inside the station. Ivy Mike was detonated at 7:15 a.m. on November 1st, 1952. The blast measured at 10.4 megatons and was the largest man-made explosion up to that time, creating a fireball 3.3 kilometers wide and a mushroom cloud 33 kilometers tall, and it completely obliterated the island of Ugalab, leaving behind a crater 2 kilometers in diameter. And with that, the world had entered the thermonuclear age. As the success of Ivy Mike was not guaranteed, a contingency weapon was prepared in case the test failed or the teller alarm design took longer than expected to perfect. Codenamed Ivy King, this was a high-yield conventional fission weapon which, unlike the Mike device, was light enough to be delivered by aircraft and could be immediately added to the US nuclear stockpile. Though the Mike shot was ultimately successful, Ivy King was nonetheless tested on November 16, 1962 with a yield of 500 kilotons. It remains the most powerful pure fission weapon ever detonated by the US and one of the most powerful overall, second only to the British 720 kiloton Orange Herald warhead. In the wake of Operation Ivy, scientists raced to create a practical, air-droppable, dry-fuel thermonuclear weapon. This effort produced an experimental 10,000 kilogram device codenamed Shrimp, whose 1.3 meter diameter, 4.5 meter long cylindrical case contained a 61 kiloton fission trigger and 400 kilograms of dry lithium deuteride fusion fuel. The fuel was enriched to contain 40% fusible lithium-6 isotope and 60% the more common lithium-7 isotope, which scientists believed was inert and would take no part in the reaction. Based on the data obtained from Ivy Mike, the yield of Shrimp was estimated at 5 megatons. Shrimp was tested at the Bravo shot of Operation Castle, conducted at Bikini Atoll in the spring of 1954. Like the Mike device, Shrimp was installed in a metal shot cab on Namu Island and surrounded by an array of scientific instruments, including dozens of high-speed cameras and a 2.3 kilometer long evacuated tunnel or light pipe to channel X-rays and neutron radiation to an unmanned instrument station. Castle Bravo was detonated at 6:45 a.m. on March 1st, 1954. Right from the start, it was clear something had gone horribly wrong. The flash from the detonation was unusually bright, even by the standards of a nuclear weapon, so bright that observers reported seeing the shadows of bones in their hands. And so powerful was the thermal pulse that sailors on ships anchored 20 kilometers away felt like they were being hit with a blowtorch, while the X-rays streamed through the light pipe, incinerating the instrumentation station, creating a second smaller fireball. Meanwhile, the main fireball kept growing and growing and growing until it seemed to engulf the entire lagoon. Buildings and instruments meant to survive the blast were incinerated, and entire islands were swept clean. As the fireball continued to expand to a monstrous 7 kilometers in diameter, one sailor recalled that we soon found ourselves under a large black and orange cloud that seemed to be dropping bright red balls of fire all over the ocean around us. I think many of us expected that we were witnessing the end of the world. Then came the shockwave, which was so powerful it nearly knocked a circling observation aircraft from the sky. On Enu Island, 30 kilometers away from ground zero, the reinforced concrete bunker protecting the bomb's firing party shook so violently that its occupants feared they would be swept into the sea. When the noise of the shock subsided, the observers were presented with the awesome sight of a white mushroom cloud 100 kilometers in diameter and towering 40 kilometers into the sky. The yield of Castle Bravo was measured at an astonishing 15 megatons, triple what scientists had predicted, and 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. This unexpected increase in yield resulted from a fundamental physics mistake. Scientists had assumed that the lithium-7 isotope, which made up the majority of the fusion fuel, would simply absorb neutrons to form lithium-8 and play no part in the fusion reaction. In reality, however, when bombarded by the high-energy neutrons from the primary, the lithium-7 fissioned into an alpha particle, a neutron, and a nucleus of tritium, generating significantly more fusion fuel and tripling the explosive yield. But the consequences of this miscalculation went far beyond a few destroyed buildings and instruments. The oversized blast carved out a 2-kilometer-wide crater in the lagoon floor, the rock, coral, and water from which was pulverized, drawn up into the fireball, and irradiated. This material then rained back to Earth as vast amounts of highly radioactive fallout. Even worse, the wind suddenly changed directions so that rather than safely blowing north over open ocean, the fallout was instead carried east, creating a 450-kilometer-long radioactive plume that engulfed the Navy support fleet, as well as the inhabited atolls of Rongelap, Alangenai, Uterik, and Ronagik. Unaware of the danger, native Marshallese children played in and even licked the radioactive dust, leading to hundreds of cases of radiation sickness and other health effects. Back on Bikini, the firing crew of NU found themselves trapped in the bunker by the fallout, forcing them to seal themselves inside for hours until a helicopter could be dispatched to rescue them. When it finally arrived, the crew ran out of the bunker holding blankets over their heads to prevent fallout from contaminating their bodies. Also caught in the fallout plume was the Daigo Fukura Maru, or Lucky Dragon No. 5, a Japanese fishing boat that was supposed to be outside the official exclusion zone. Blanketed in fine radioactive dust, the ship's crew suffered severe burns and radiation sickness, with the radio operator dying later from his injuries. This incident severely strained diplomatic relations between the United States and the Japanese, who likened the disaster to a second Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the wake of Castle Bravo, the US military expanded the exclusion zone around the Pacific Proving Grounds to nearly 1.5 million square kilometers. However, this only served to disrupt the Japanese fishing industry, further escalating tensions. Within 48 hours of the Castle Bravo test, the US military evacuated the inhabitants of Rongelap, Rongerik, and Alaganea and Ultarik to Kwajalein Atoll. However, this proved too little too late for many Marshallese, especially the inhabitants of Rongelap, who received high doses of radiation and began suffering from high rates of thyroid and cervical cancer, as well as birth defects and other chronic health problems. In 1957, the US government declared Rongelap safe for human habitation and allowed 82 people to return. Unfortunately, many staple food items like arrowroot, coconuts, and fish were found to be heavily contaminated with plutonium and other radioactive isotopes, causing further long-term health problems. But while the inhabitants of Rongelap appealed to the US government to evacuate them back to Kwajalein, these pleas fell on deaf ears. This, along with the 1957 declaration by the US Atomic Energy Commission that, quote, the habitation of these people on the island will afford most valuable ecological radiation data on human beings. This led to widespread speculation that the inhabitants were being deliberately kept on Rongelap as radiation guinea pigs. Finally, in May 1985, international environmental organization Greenpeace launched Operation Exodus, using their flagship, the Rainbow Warrior, to relocate all 300 islanders and 100 tons of building materials to the islands of Mejato and Ebai, 180 kilometers away. The following year, the US government approved the creation of a $150 million trust fund to pay compensation to the Marshallese victims of the Castle Bravo disaster. This fund, however, was quickly depleted, and despite repeated calls for the amount to be increased, in both 2005 and 2012, the US government asserted that it had paid sufficient compensation to the Marshallese and had no legal responsibility to pay more. The former inhabitants of Rongelap and other atolls contaminated by Castle Bravo remain in exile to this day, wondering when they will finally be able to return to their ancestral homes. Meanwhile, the US government agreed to pay more than $15 million in compensation to the crew of the Daigo Fukura Maru and their families, renormalizing relations between the United States and Japan. However, the Castle Bravo incident proved deeply traumatizing to the Japanese people, so much so that it inspired filmmaker Ishiro Honda to write and direct a film about the looming danger of nuclear annihilation, symbolized by a giant radioactive reptile rampaging across Japan. You might know better as Godzilla. Fallout from Castle Bravo drifted around the world, being detected as far afield as Australia, Europe, and the United States. But while this attracted international outrage and calls to ban further development of thermonuclear weapons, the strategic demands of the ever-escalating Cold War pushed the US government to press on with the hydrogen bomb project. As with the earlier Ivy Mike test, scientists prepared a contingency weapon to provide stopgap thermonuclear capability in case the dry fuel bomb took longer than expected to perfect. Known as the Mark 16 or Jughead, the bomb was effectively a scaled-down version of the Mike device, using cryogenic liquid deuterium as its fuel. Measuring 1.5 meters in diameter and 7.5 meters long, weighing 19,000 kilograms and with an estimated yield of 5 megatons, the Mark 16 could only be carried by a specially modified Convair B-36 Peacemaker strategic bomber fitted with dwarf flasks to keep the deuterium topped up. However, the success of Castle Bravo made the cumbersome weapon unnecessary, and it was withdrawn from the US stockpile after only a few months. The first proper thermonuclear device to be officially developed by the United States was instead the Mark 14 bomb, which was first tested on April 26, 1954 in the Castle Union shot with a yield of 7 megatons. However, the Mark 14 secondary stage was fueled by 95% enriched lithium-6 deuteride, which was extremely expensive to refine. Since the Castle Bravo shot had demonstrated that the much cheaper lithium-7 isotope was just as effective, only 5 Mark 14s were built and deployed before being replaced in 1956 by the 15-megaton Mark 17 and Mark 24, the world's first mass-produced thermonuclear weapons. The urgency with which these weapons were deployed was a response to alarming developments in Soviet nuclear technology. On August 12, 1953, 9 months after Ivy Mike but 7 months before Castle Bravo, the Soviets detonated a 400-kiloton device codenamed RDS-6S at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. The Soviet government announced that the device was a dry thermonuclear weapon which, unlike the building-sized Ivy Mike, was small enough to be carried by an aircraft. But while this supposed tipping of the thermonuclear scales alarmed US military planners, the Soviet claim wasn't quite accurate. The Soviets first learned of the hydrogen bomb concept through documents supplied by Manhattan Project physicist and atomic spy Klaus Fuchs. Unfortunately, these documents described very early concepts for the classical super, and Fuchs was arrested in 1950 before the crucial tele-alarm breakthrough was made. The Soviets, therefore, had very little to go on when developing their own hydrogen bombs. However, they had their own Edward Teller in the form of physicist Andrei Sakharov, who independently worked out all the same design principles as his American counterpart. Sakharov's first idea, which he dubbed the Truba, or pipe, was very similar to Teller's initial concept for the super, consisting of a regular fission bomb attached to a long cylinder filled with deuterium and tritium, though Sakharov replaced Teller's lightweight beryllium tambo with one made of heavier uranium-238 in order to increase compression of the fuel. However, like Teller, Sakharov soon realized that this configuration was not feasible and instead came up with a second idea similar to Teller's abandoned alarm clock design, wherein alternating layers of uranium-238 and lithium-6 deuteride were wrapped around a fission bomb's core. Dubbed sloika after a type of Russian layer cake, it was this design, and not a proper thermonuclear weapon, which was detonated in the 1953 RDS-6S test. Nonetheless, sloika allowed the 40-kiloton yield of the primary to be boosted tenfold, giving the Soviets a powerful and, more importantly, deployable new weapon. But while a step in the right direction, the sloika design was bulky and could not be scaled up further. But Sakharov soon discovered the principle of staged radiation implosion and developed his third idea, effectively a version of the Teller alarm design. The first true Soviet nuclear weapon, codenamed RDS-37, was tested on November 22, 1955, with a yield of 1.6 megatons. The Soviets had finally caught up with the Americans in the thermonuclear waste. What followed was an intense 3-year period of testing in which the United States and the Soviet Union detonated a total of 177 nuclear warheads, 40 of them thermonuclear. This period also saw the United Kingdom become a thermonuclear power, detonating its first hydrogen bomb, codenamed Grapple X, over Christmas Island in the South Pacific on November 8, 1957. All this atmospheric testing, however, raised public fears over the possible global effects of fallout, especially when high levels of the radioactive isotope strontium-90 were detected in milk and baby teeth across the United States. This prompted Nobel laureate Linus Pauling and 9,000 scientists across 43 countries to sign a petition calling for the end of nuclear testing. While Edward Teller and others tried to downplay the fallout risk, in October 1958, the United States, Soviet Union, and United Kingdom agreed on a moratorium on atmospheric nuclear testing. Instead, testing moved underground, with the United States conducting its first underground weapons test, codenamed Plum Bob Brainer, on September 19, 1957 at the Nevada test site. But if anti-nuclear activists hoped that the moratorium would immediately lead to a comprehensive test ban or a reduction in nuclear weapon stockpiles, they were bitterly disappointed. Throughout the moratorium, both American and Soviet nuclear stockpiles continued to grow, while innovation in warhead size, yield, and efficiency stagnated due to a lack of testing. It was only a matter of time before that uneasy truce was broken. In the end, it was the Soviets who broke the moratorium in the most spectacular fashion possible. On July 10, 1961, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev summoned Andrei Sakharov and other nuclear physicists to the Kremlin and instructed them to resume nuclear testing in the fall. Sakharov, who by now harbored serious doubts as to the morality of thermonuclear weapons, protested that further testing was not necessary, as he and his colleagues had already learned all they needed to know about nuclear weapons design. Khrushchev was furious, barking that, "Sakharov, don't try to tell us what to do or how to behave. We understand politics. I'd be a jellyfish and not chairman of the Council of Ministers if I listened to people like Sakharov." In reality, Khrushchev was in a delicate political position. Not only had he just survived an attempted coup by pro-Stalinist hardliners, but the Soviet Union lagged far behind the United States in its nuclear arsenal. The resumption of nuclear testing was Khrushchev's attempt to look strong to both his countrymen and on a world stage. Thus, it was to his delight that one of the physicists in the meeting suggested building and testing a 100-megaton bomb as the ultimate demonstration of Soviet nuclear power. Khrushchev immediately seized upon the idea, declaring, "Let the 100 megaton bomb hang over the capitalists like a sword of Damocles." Though officially designated Product 602, the 100 megaton bomb later became known as the Tsar Bomba, or Emperor Bomb, in the tradition of other giant Russian objects like the giant bronze Tsar's Pushka cannon and the Tsar Kolochel bell on display at the Kremlin. 2 meters in diameter, 8 meters long, and weighing 27,000 kilograms, the Tsar Bomba could only be carried by a specially modified Tupolev Tu-95 Bear strategic bomber, which had its bomb bay doors removed, so the bomb hung mostly out of the fuselage. The bomb was a 3-stage device, with a combination first and second fusion stage on one side of the fission primary and a third stage on the other side, each module containing 50 megatons of energy for a total of 100 megatons. Sakharov, however, soon grew concerned about the massive amounts of fallout the bomb would produce and ordered the uranium tamper in the third stage to be replaced with one made of inert lead, cutting the yield in half. Khrushchev revealed the existence of the Tsar Bomba on October 17, 1961, in a speech to the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party, announcing, "Since I have digressed from the prepared text, I might as well say that the testing of our new nuclear weapons is going on very successfully. We shall complete it very soon, probably by the end of October. We shall evidently round out the tests by exploding a hydrogen bomb equivalent to 50 million tons of TNT. We have said that we have a bomb as powerful as 100 million tons of TNT, and we have it too. But we are not going to explode it because even if exploded in the remotest of places, we're likely to break our own windows. We will therefore not do it yet. But by exploding the 50 million bomb, we shall test the triggering device of the 100 million one. However, God grant, as people said in the old days, that we never have to explode these bombs over any territory. That is our fondest dream." Though this announcement was immediately condemned by the international community, the test went ahead as planned. On October 30th, 1961, the modified Tu-95V took off from Olynya Airfield on the Kola Peninsula and flew toward the test site on the Arctic island of Novaya Zemlya. At 11:32 a.m., the bomb was released at an altitude of 10.3 kilometers, whereupon the pilot, Major Andrei Doronotstev, immediately pulled his aircraft into a sharp bank. The bomb was fitted with a parachute to slow its descent, allowing the aircraft to fly 45 kilometers before detonation, a distance which, according to calculations, would give the crew a 50-50 shot of survival. Around a minute after release, the bomb detonated at an altitude of 4.2 kilometers, lighting up the sky with a blinding flash that lasted for nearly a minute. As one cameraman filming the test later recalls, the clouds beneath the aircraft and in the distance were lit up by the powerful flash. A sea of light spread under the hatch, and even clouds began to glow and became transparent. At that moment, our aircraft emerged from between two cloud layers, and down below in the gap, a huge bright orange ball was emerging. The ball was powerful and arrogant, like Jupiter. Slowly and silently it crept upwards, having broken through the thick layer of clouds. It kept growing. It seemed to suck the whole Earth into it. The spectacle was fantastic, unreal, supernatural. Another witness remarked that it was as if the Earth was killed. Within seconds, the fireball expanded to nearly 10 kilometers in diameter, large enough to engulf all of Midtown and downtown Manhattan, but it was prevented from reaching the ground by its own reflected shockwave. The shockwave caught up to the Tu-95V at a distance of 115 kilometers, causing it to drop a kilometer in altitude. However, the aircraft survived and made a safe landing back in Olynya. 10 minutes later, the fireball had given way to an enormous mushroom cloud, 96 kilometers in diameter and 67 kilometers tall. At 58 megatons, it was the largest man-made explosion in history. The flash was observed more than 1,000 kilometers away in Norway, Greenland, and Alaska. The mushroom cloud could be seen 800 kilometers from ground zero, and the shockwave shattered windows 780 kilometers away. Even before the test's success was officially announced, it was detected by seismographs and other instruments all over the world, the seismic and atmospheric pressure waves from the blast having circled the globe 3 times. Interestingly, the Tsar Bomba was also one of the cleanest nuclear weapons ever tested, with 97% of the total yield coming from nuclear fusion alone. Unsurprisingly, the international reaction to the Tsar Bomba was one of outrage and condemnation. Strangely, however, the United States' reaction was more subdued and dismissive, with an official White House statement declaring that there is no mystery about producing a 50-megaton bomb. The United States government considered this matter carefully several years ago and concluded that such weapons would not provide an essential military capability. US military planners argued that not only was the Tsar Bomba unwieldy to deploy, but that such high-yield bombs made for inefficient weapons. This is because blast damage scales according to the cubic root of a weapon's explosive yield, meaning a 100 megaton bomb still inflicts only around twice the damage of a 10 megaton bomb, despite being around 10 times heavier. Thus, it was far more efficient to shower a target with multiple lower-yield warheads than one massive one. Yet despite such dismissive statements, in the wake of the Tsar Bomba test, the United States seriously considered developing its own high-yield bombs to attack deeply buried targets like mountain command bunkers. This led to the development of the Big Test Vehicle, or BTV, and the Flashback, which were even larger than the Tsar Bomber and had planned yields of between 50 and 100 megatons. However, no realistic role could be found for such monster weapons, and both projects were quickly cancelled. To date, the most powerful nuclear weapon ever deployed by the United States is the Mark 41 bomb, which was introduced in 1961 and had a nominal yield of 23 megatons. While the Tsar Bomber heralded the resumption of atmospheric nuclear testing, this period was thankfully short-lived. In the wake of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear Armageddon, on August 5, 1963, the US, Soviet Union, and UK signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, banning all nuclear testing on the ground, underwater, and in space. Underground testing, however, does continue to this day. Today, there are 9 nuclear arms nations: the US, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, France, the People's Republic of China, India, Pakistan, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, as well as Israel. Between them, they hold some 19,000 nuclear warheads, the majority of them thermonuclear or boosted fission weapons, with a combined yield of some 4 gigatons of TNT, enough to destroy the world several times over. On witnessing the test of the first atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer famously is said to have declared, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But it was Edward Teller, Andrei Sakharov, and all the others who cracked the secret of the hydrogen bomb who truly gave mankind the power to destroy themselves, a power we'll hopefully never use. On the morning of August 27, 1939, a small aircraft was towed onto the runway at Maraheny Airfield in Mecklenburg, northern Germany. To the handful of observers gathered at the edge of the field, the craft must have looked like something out of science fiction, with its gleaming barrel-shaped fuselage, gaping nose intake, and stubby wings awkwardly mounted high atop its fuselage. More baffling still, it lacked the one feature every aircraft was supposed to have: a propeller. When test pilot Erich Vorstitz climbed into the cockpit and started the engine, the air filled not with the familiar drone of reciprocating pistons, but an unearthly, high-pitched screech. Then, as if propelled by magic, the aircraft lurched forward and trundled down the runway before leaping into the air. For the next 6 minutes, Vorstitz circled the airfield, reaching a maximum speed of 598 kilometers an hour before touching back down on the runway. In that moment, aviation history changed forever as the Heinkel HE-178 became the first aircraft to fly under jet power. Within 2 decades, piston-powered aircraft would become all but obsolete in commercial and military aircraft. The jet age had begun. But who invented this now ubiquitous form of aircraft propulsion, and how did it come to rule the skies? Well, light up your afterburners and let's dive into the danger zone, exploring the fascinating history of the jet engine. By the end of the 1930s, it was becoming clear that conventional reciprocating engine and propeller technology had been pushed to its limits. On April 26, 1939, German test pilot Fritz Wendel set a world airspeed record for piston-powered aircraft when he flew the Messerschmitt Me-209V1 prototype fighter to a blistering 755 kilometers an hour, about 470 miles per hour. This record would not be broken until 1969, and then only by 25 kilometers an hour. At higher speeds, propeller blades begin to travel supersonically, forming shockwaves that reduce their efficiency and prevent aircraft from flying any faster. One solution to this problem is to fly at higher altitudes where there's less air resistance. However, at these altitudes, propellers must spin faster to generate sufficient thrust, and the thinner air starves piston engines of oxygen and thus power. Of course, these are partially solvable problems. For example, more thrust can be generated through the use of specially designed supersonic propellers, but even then, the speed record for propeller-driven aircraft is 925 km per hour or 575 miles per hour, set by the Russian Tupolev Tu-95 strategic bomber. Thus, for an aircraft to fly faster in a practical kind of way, an entirely new kind of propulsion system was needed, and enter the jet engine. As previously covered in our video, Was the First Jet Plane Really Flown in 1910 on our sister aviation channel, Higher Learning, the idea of propelling an aircraft using a jet of air instead of a spinning propeller is nearly as old as aviation itself. As early as 1910, Romanian inventor and aerodynamicist Henri Coanda claimed to have built and briefly flown an innovative biplane powered by what he called a turbo propulsor, which unfortunately caught fire and crashed on its maiden flight. While Coanda's claims are disputed, disputed. What is known is that his turbo propulsor was not a jet engine as we would recognize it today. Rather, it was a form of motor jet, in which a conventional piston engine drives a turbine to generate a high-speed air jet. In certain motor jet designs, fuel is injected into the jet and ignited to produce extra thrust, as in a modern afterburner. The first verified motor jet-powered aircraft to take to the skies was the Italian Caproni Campini N1, which made its maiden flight on August 27, 1940. Yet despite its innovative power plant, the N1 was unable to outperform conventional propeller-powered aircraft of the era and suffered from unacceptably high fuel consumption and overheating. And while the Soviet Union also briefly experimented with motor jet-powered fighters like the Mickey Angarevich I-250 and the Sukhoi Su-5, it soon became clear that motor jets were a technological dead end, and these unusual power plants soon became little more than a footnote in the history of aircraft propulsion. A true jet engine, or turbojet, is, in principle at least, remarkably simple, consisting of just 4 basic components: a compressor, a combustion chamber, a turbine, and a nozzle. Air enters at the front of the engine, where it is compressed by the compressor before being fed into the combustion chamber. Here, the air is mixed with fuel and ignited, which creates hot, high-pressure exhaust. This exhaust is then passed through the turbine before being expelled out of the engine, generating forward thrust. Meanwhile, the turbine extracts a small amount of energy from the exhaust and uses it via a connecting shaft to drive the compressor, making the whole cycle self-sustaining. The first modern gas turbine was patented in 1791 by English inventor John Barber, who planned to use it to propel a horseless carriage. Similar devices were created in 1872 by Dr. F. Stolzer and in 1903 by Agus Elling, the latter of which became the first successful self-sustaining gas turbine. In 1918, Dr. Stanford A. Moss of the American firm General Electric invented a 2-stage turbine called the turbo supercharger, or simply turbocharger, though this was not intended for powering vehicles directly. Rather, the turbocharger used waste energy from a conventional piston engine's exhaust to feed more air into the engine's intake manifold, increasing its power input. 2 decades later, this innovation would prove vital to the Allied strategic bombing campaigns over Western Europe and Japan. However, none of these early gas turbines were suited to use in aviation. For the technology to become a truly viable form of propulsion, a number of different technical problems had to be first overcome, such as finding materials heat-resistant enough to prevent the turbine blades from distorting or the combustion chamber from burning through, while simultaneously being lightweight enough to mount in an aircraft. Now, as we've covered many times on this channel, few truly groundbreaking innovations are the product of a single brilliant mind. Rather, they are developed over many years or even decades by dozens of hardworking and often overlooked individuals. But while the jet engine is no exception, it would likely not have been developed or adopted as early as it was were it not for the contributions of 2 key figures who both came up with the idea at around the same time and unwittingly found themselves in a high-stakes race to get their groundbreaking inventions into the air. These extraordinary men were Sir Frank Whittle and Hans von Ohain. Frank Whittle was born on June 1, 1907 in Coventry in England, the eldest son of mechanic Moses Whittle and his wife Sarah Garlick. Fascinated by machines from an early age, Whittle learned about practical engineering by helping out in his father's workshop, and in 1923, at the age of 16, he signed up to join the Royal Air Force as an aircraft apprentice. Unfortunately, he was rejected when his short height and slight build caused him to fail his medical examination. Determined to join up, he embarked on a regimen of intense physical exercise to bulk himself up and applied twice more, once under an assumed name, before finally being accepted. He was then sent to No. 1 Squadron of No. 4 Apprentices Wing at RAF Cranwell for a 3-year course in aircraft maintenance. To Whittle's dismay, he soon discovered that the strict RAF discipline was not to his liking and that his physical limitations made his becoming a pilot an unlikely prospect. He grew so depressed that he seriously considered deserting, only keeping up his spirits by joining the Model Aircraft Society. Then, in 1926, the quality of Whittle's models so impressed the commander of the apprentice wing that he recommended him for officer training at RAF College Cranwell. Here, Whittle finally got the chance to take flight training, soloing in 1927 after only 13.5 hours of instruction. He soon became an accomplished pilot, gaining a reputation for daring stunt flying. As part of his officer course, Whittle was required to prepare a thesis, which he decided to write on future developments in aircraft technology. Whittle calculated that an aircraft could achieve maximum range by flying at high altitudes, where reduced air density results in less drag. However, the physics of propellers and piston engines meant that at such altitudes, the aircraft's performance would also be reduced. was while pondering this problem in 1929 that Whittle had an epiphany. Why not replace the piston engine and propeller with a gas turbine, which could theoretically produce far greater thrust at higher altitudes? Whittle obtained a patent for his engine design in 1930 at the age of only 22, and his superiors at RAF Cranwell were sufficiently impressed that they arranged for him to present his idea to the Air Ministry. However, as Whittle later recalled, the result was extremely disappointing. The net outcome was a letter from the ministry to the effect that any form of gas turbine was impractical. Indeed, the Air Ministry was so uninterested in Whittle's idea that they allowed his patent to be openly published. As a result, his design soon became known to engineers across Europe, including, fatefully, in Germany. Nonetheless, Whittle continued to develop the design on his own time, though he had so little money that when his patent expired in 1935, he was unable to renew it. But Whittle was not entirely without friends, and in that same year, some fellow RAF officers arranged a meeting between Whittle and Lancelot White of the banking firm O.T. Falcon Partners. As White later recalls, the impression he made was overwhelming. White recalls, "I have never been so quickly convinced or happy to find one's higher standards met. This was genius, not talent." Whittle expressed his ideas with superb conciseness. "Reciprocating engines are exhausted. They have hundreds of parts jerking to and fro, and they cannot be made more powerful without becoming too complicated. The engine of the future must produce 2,000 horsepower with one moving part, a spinning turbine and compressor." White immediately agreed to fund the establishment of a small experimental aircraft company dubbed Power Jets Limited. While the RAF still considered the turbojet impractical for military use, they nonetheless allowed Whittle to pursue the venture provided he spend no more than 6 hours a week on it, an order he flagrantly ignored. Whittle and his assistants set up shop in the workshop of the British Thomson Houston Company, who manufactured the components for Whittle's first experimental test engine, dubbed the Whittle Unit, or WU. Very much a proof of concept, the WU used a single-stage centrifugal compressor connected to a single combustion chamber and a single-stage turbine, the whole assembly being housed in a sheet metal enclosure to catch turbine blades and other components should they fly off the engine. After 2 years of work, the WU was finally ready for its first test run on April 12, 1937. Whittle later described the event thusly. "Immediately, with a rising scream, the engine began to accelerate out of control. I promptly shut the valve, but the uncontrolled acceleration continued. Everyone around me took to their heels, except me. I was paralyzed with fright and remained rooted to the spot." A few seconds later, however, the engine decelerated and came back under control. The problem, it was discovered, was a puddle of fuel which had gathered in the combustion chamber during a previous fuel pump test. Whittle installed a drain at the bottom of the chamber and tried again the following day, though this second test was no less hair-raising than the first. To quote him again, "This experience was more frightening than the first because local overheating had caused combustion chamber joints to leak, and the escaping fuel vapor took fire above the engine. Altogether, a petrifying situation, except for those who once more disappeared with record-breaking speed." The quote ends. This time, the problem was found to be a faulty fuel valve. This, too, was easily resolved, and after a few more successful tests, Whittle and his team were ready to demonstrate the engine for Dr. David R. By, Deputy Director of Scientific Research at the Air Ministry. The demonstration, which took place on June 30th, 1939, so impressed By that just weeks later, the Air Ministry awarded Power Jets a contract to produce a new engine designated the W1 for an experimental aircraft to be built by the Gloucester Aircraft Company. The aircraft, known as the Gloucester E-2839 Pioneer, was delivered to the airfield at Brockworth, Gloucestershire on April 7th, 1941. By now a fully qualified test pilot, Frank Whittle performed many of the initial taxi tests himself using a non-flight-worthy version of the W1 engine. Finally, the aircraft was fitted with a proper engine and on May 15th, 1941, flew for the first time with test pilot Gary Sayer at the controls. During the flight, which lasted 17 minutes, Sayer achieved a maximum speed of 560 km per hour, only slightly slower than the RAF's fastest fighter at the time, the Supermarine Spitfire Mark V. But while this was a monumental achievement, it was not the first flight of a turbojet-powered aircraft. Unknown to Whittle, he had been beaten to the punch by 2 years by a similarly brilliant and driven German engineer. Hans Joachim Pabst von Ahain was born on December 14th, 1911 in Dessau, northern Germany. Like Frank Whittle, von Ahain first conceived of the jet engine as a 22-year-old university student. Otherwise, however, the two men's career trajectories could not have been more different. After obtaining his PhD in physics and aerodynamics from the University of Göttingen in 1933, von Ahain became a junior assistant to Robert Wichard Pohl, director of the university's Physical Institute. In 1936, he patented his jet engine concept and, along with automotive engineer Max Hahn, attempted to build a working example. Unfortunately, von Ahain and Hahn could not get the fuel to ignite and burn stably in the combustion chamber, causing flames to shoot out the back of the engine and the electric starter motor to overheat. Nonetheless, their work soon caught the attention of Ernst Heinkel, founder and director of aircraft manufacturer Heinkel Flugzeugwerke in Warnemünde. On Pohl's recommendation, Heinkel hired von Ahain and provided him with the funding to continue his jet engine research. By February 1937, von Ahain had assembled a new engine called the HES-1, fueled by hydrogen gas. Though the engine ran well, the hot-burning hydrogen quickly damaged the metal components. Von Ahain thus modified the design to run on kerosene, producing the more reliable HES-3, which could produce 4.9 kilonewtons of thrust. To flight test the new engine, Ernst Heinkel tasked his two best engineers, Walter and Siegfried Gunther, to design an experimental aircraft dubbed the HE-178. 7.6 meters long with 7.3 meter long elliptical wings mounted high on the fuselage and a conventional tail dragger undercarriage, the HE-178 was powered by a single HES-3 engine mounted behind the pilot, fed through an air inlet mounted on the nose. The HE-178's maiden flight took place at Heinkel's Marahiner Aerodrome on August 27, 1939, just 5 days before Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Present on the field that day were several top officials from the Luftwaffe, including General Oberst Ernst Udet and General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch. Ernst Heinkel later describes the historic event. He, test pilot Erich Vorsitz, was flying. A new era had begun. The hideous wail of the engine was music to our ears. He circled again, smoothly and gracefully. The riggers began to wave like madmen. Calmly, he flew around once more, and when 6 minutes were up, he started to land. He cut out the jet unit, then misjudged the approach and had to sideslip. Sideslip with a new, dangerous and tricky plane. We held our breath, but the HE-178 landed perfectly, taxied and came to a stop. A magnificent landing. Within seconds, we had all rushed over to Vorsitz and the plane. The riggers hoisted both of us onto their shoulders and carried us around, roaring with enthusiasm. But Heinkel and von Ahain's glory would be short-lived, for despite having witnessed history in the making, the Luftwaffe observers left the demonstration largely unimpressed. A mechanical fault had forced Vorsitz to fly with his landing gear extended, limiting his top speed to only 598 km per hour, only slightly faster than Germany's standard fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf-109. Furthermore, the rapid advance of German forces across Europe convinced military planners that the war would be quickly concluded, making new aviation technologies like jet propulsion unnecessary. By the time the Luftwaffe changed its mind about the value of jets, other aircraft manufacturers had already leapfrogged ahead of Heinkel and von Ahain's first prototypes. In 1940, for example, designer Anselm Franz of rival aircraft manufacturer Junkers Flugzeug und Motorwerke developed the Jumo 004 engine, which used a more efficient axial flow compressor in place of von Ahain's centrifugal flow compressor. BMW and Brander Buschisch Motorenwerken, or Bramo, also developed similar engines, while the Reich Air Ministry, or RLM, secretly contracted Junkers, Messerschmitt, and others to manufacture their own jet fighters. Despite being left out of this request, Heinkel proceeded with the development of a twin-engine jet fighter called the HE-280, which incorporated a number of key innovations, including tricycle landing gear and a pneumatically propelled ejection seat, the first in aviation history to save a pilot's life in an emergency. After lengthy delays caused by developmental difficulties with its intended engine, the HES-8, the HE-280 finally made its maiden flight on the 22nd of September 1940, becoming the world's first jet fighter to take to the skies. Subsequent test flights proved the HE-280 to be a superbly swift and agile aircraft, easily outmaneuvering the Luftwaffe's best conventional fighter, the Focke-Wulf FW-190, in mock combat. Nonetheless, the RLM ultimately rejected the design, and a rival firm, Messerschmitt's Me-262 Schwalbe, became the world's first operational jet fighter, entering service in April 1944. Thankfully for the Allies, several factors prevented the Me-262 from having a significant impact on the war. Chief among these was Adolf Hitler, who, believing that Germany should always be on the offensive, ordered that the new jets be used for ground attack, a task for which they were ill-suited, rather than shooting down Allied bombers. And even when the Me-262 was deployed in its proper role as a fighter, technical and logistical problems prevented the aircraft from reaching its full potential. The primitive metallurgy of the Junkers Jumo 004 engines gave them an extremely short lifespan, requiring them to be removed and overhauled after only a handful of flight hours, while Allied bombardment of factories frequently interrupted the production of new engines and spare parts. Worse still, chronic fuel shortages caused the Me-262 squadrons to spend most of their time on the ground. Meanwhile, in Britain, Gloucester developed his own jet fighter, the Gloucester Meteor, powered by two of Frank Whittle's upgraded Powerjet's W2 engines. First flown on March 5, 1943, the Meteor was the Allies' only operational jet fighter of the war, though it never saw combat against manned aircraft. Instead, its 970 km/h top speed made it invaluable for chasing down the German V-1 flying bombs that terrorized southern England between June 1944 and March 1945, with Meteor squadrons scoring 13 victories by the end of the war. And for more on this, please do check out our previous video, A Wingtip and a Prayer, the insane way British pilots defeated Germany's secret weapon. While the Meteor was under development, the British government secretly shipped a Powerjet's engine and a handful of engineers across the Atlantic to the General Electric facility in Lynn, Massachusetts, in the hope that the Americans could improve the design and put it into mass production. The GE team that received the engine was sworn to secrecy, as former engineer Joseph Sirota later recalled. Our colleagues called us the Hush Hush Boys. We couldn't talk to anyone about our work. The FBI man warned me that if I gave away any secrets, the penalty was death. Indeed, the project was so secret that no outside contractors could be brought in to modify the workshop or build test stands and other equipment, forcing the engineers to carry out this work themselves. They were also hampered by a lack of adequate tooling. To quote, our wrenches didn't fit the nuts and bolts because they were on the metric system. We had to grind them open a little more to get inside. Despite these difficulties, in March 1942, just 5 months after the project started, the GE engineers successfully bench-tested their redesigned engine, the IA, producing 5.8 kilonewtons of thrust. The IA was subsequently installed in an experimental fighter aircraft, the Bell Aircraft XP-59 Air Comet. In keeping with the top-secret nature of the project, during ground handling, the XP-59 was fitted with a dummy propeller to disguise its true nature. The Air Comet made its maiden flight on October 2, 1942 at Murakami Airfield in California, today Edwards Air Force Base, with test pilot Colonel Lawrence Craigie at the controls. Unfortunately, the first American jet proved underpowered and never entered service, though GE would later refine its IA engine into the J-31, the first jet engine to be mass-produced in the United States. In 1945, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star became the United States' first operational jet fighter, serving with distinction in the Korean War alongside other early jets like the North American F-86 Sabre. The commercial aviation market followed suit in 1952 with the introduction of the British de Havilland DH-106 Comet, the world's first jet airliner. Within just a few years, the age of piston-engined aircraft had finally come to an end. Jets now ruled the skies, making the globe just a little bit smaller with each passing year. Of course, jet engines have come a long way since those early days, seeing dramatic improvements in thrust, fuel efficiency, and reliability. But, well, that's a story for another time, isn't it? Thanks for watching. Who invented the telephone? How about the airplane? The light bulb? Well, if you paid attention in high school history class, you probably know the standard answers: Alexander Graham Bell, the Wright brothers, and Thomas Edison. But if you've been watching our channels long enough, you know that when it comes to the big inventions that have most shaped our modern world, things are never so simple. And the story of the invention of the light bulb's no different. While perhaps the most famous creation attributed to inventor extraordinaire Thomas Edison, the incandescent light bulb was actually in development for nearly a century before Edison finally perfected it and brought it to the masses. This is the story of the dozens of inventors who struggled to harness the power of electricity to banish the darkness of light and to bring about a technological and social revolution. To create a practical electric light, one first needs a reliable source of electricity, and this would not become available until 1800 when Italian scientist Alessandro Volta created the voltaic pile, the ancestor of modern electric battery. 2 years later, English scientist Sir Humphrey Davy used a massive battery composed of 2,000 electrochemical cells to pass a current across 2 carbon rods, generating an extremely bright arc. He next passed this current through a thin strip of platinum, which, due to its high electrical resistance and high melting point, glowed white hot. Over the following century, several inventors would develop and patent similar filament-based incandescent lamps, further refining the idea of encasing the filament in a glass bulb and pumping out the air to prevent the filament from oxidizing and burning up. These pioneers included Scottish author James Lindsay in 1835, Belgian lithographer Marcellin Jabbar in 1838, British scientists Warren Leroux and Frederick de Molins in 1840, and French magician Jean-Robert Houdon in 1851. However, none of those early light bulbs proved commercially viable. For one thing, most of them used platinum filaments, which were prohibitively expensive, while the pump technology of the time prevented a hard enough vacuum from being drawn, causing the filaments to last only a few hours before burning up. Furthermore, giant banks of batteries were not a practical source of electricity for everyday use. Thus, even if long-lasting light bulbs could be developed, their large-scale adoption would have to await the introduction of practical electrical generators turned by water or steam power. But when such a technology finally did become widely available, the first electric lights to see practical use were not incandescent bulbs, but rather arc lamps based on Humphrey Davy's 1802 experiments with carbon rods. Davy's original design, which used fixed rods, was impractical as the heat of the arc steadily vaporized the ends of the rods, widening the gap between them to widen and eventually caused the arc to go out. This problem was solved in the 1840s by English inventors Thomas Wright and William Straight, who developed clockwork mechanisms to maintain the gap between the rods. Later in 1875, Russian engineer Pavel Yablokov invented an even simpler lamp called the Yablokov candle, which used two parallel carbon rods separated by a block of plaster of Paris. Once an arc was struck, the rods would steadily be consumed from the top to the bottom, the constant gap between them eliminating the need for an adjustment mechanism. In 1846, the Opera Theatre in Paris became the first public building to be lit by electricity using arc lamps powered by giant banks of zinc-carbon batteries. Soon, more efficient steam-powered generators became available, and other facilities were fitted with electric lights, including lighthouses, train stations, factories, and large street intersections and public squares. The first arc lamps in the United States were installed in the Wanamaker department store in Philadelphia in 1878, while the first in the UK were installed in front of the Bank of England in London in 1881. But while arc lamps were fine for lighting large open spaces, their light was far too harsh for ordinary household use. Thankfully, by this time, research on incandescent lamps was beginning to show promise. One of the first practical incandescent lamp designs was patented in 1872 by Russian inventor Alexander Lodygin. Lodygin's bulb did not use a traditional filament, but a pair of carbon rods arranged so the current would pass to the second rod once the first burned out. To get around the limitations of vacuum pumps, Lodygin instead filled the bulb with inert nitrogen, an arrangement that would later become standard, albeit with different gases. Lodygin was later among the first to patent a light bulb using a tungsten filament, another now standard design feature, but unfortunately at the time, tungsten was prohibitively expensive to work with, and none of Lodygin's designs saw commercial production. The same year as Lodygin, Canadian medical student Henry Woodward and hotel keeper Matthew Evans patented a similar light bulb design consisting of carbon rods mounted in a nitrogen-filled glass tube. Their invention was inspired by an incident in 1873 when the pair were experimenting with a high-voltage induction coil when a part of their apparatus began to spark, creating a bright light that lit up the room. As Woodward later recalled, "I thought if one could only confine that in a globe of some sort, what an invention we would have. It would revolutionize the world." Shortly after patenting their bulb design, Woodward and Evans demonstrated their invention to a group of financiers at the Morrison Brass Foundry in Toronto. There were 4 or 5 of us sitting around a large table. Woodward closed the switch and gradually we saw the carbon become first red and gradually lighter and lighter in color until it beamed forth in beautiful light. This was the most exciting moment of my experience. Unfortunately, the investors were not impressed, and Woodward and Evans were widely mocked as eccentrics and crackpots for pursuing such a useless invention. After several years of fruitlessly seeking funding to improve and commercialize their light bulb, the pair eventually gave up, and in 1879 they sold their patent to Thomas Edison for $5,000, about $160,000 today. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a British physicist and chemist named Joseph Swan was having much better luck commercializing his own light bulb design. Swan began his research in the 1850s, developing a bulb with a filament made of carbonized paper. Unfortunately, vacuum pump technology prevented Swan's bulb from achieving practical longevity, and he abandoned his research. In 1865, however, German chemist Hermann Sprengel invented the Sprengel pump, which used falling mercury to achieve lower pressures than previously possible, spurring Swan to return to his experiments. On January 17, 1979, Swan successfully demonstrated a new bulb design at a meeting of the Newcastle Chemical Society. But while the bulb, which used a carbon rod from an arc lamp instead of a filament, was the most advanced of its time, it was still a flawed design. The carbon rod offered very low resistance and thus required a very large current to make it glow, making the bulb very inefficient. The bulb only lasted 40 hours and grew progressively dimmer as it burned, as carbon evaporating from the rod was deposited on the inside surface of the lamp. But Swan was undeterred, and in 1880 patented a specially treated carbonized thread filament which drew far less current and eliminated the blackening problem. In February 1879, Swan installed the first incandescent streetlights on Mosley Street in Newcastle upon Tyne. In 1880, his own house in Gateshead became the first in history to be lit by incandescent lamps, while in 1881 the Savoy Theatre in London became the first public building to be so illuminated. That same year, the technology was used at sea for the first time, with the SS City of Richmond being the first civilian vessel and HMS Inflexible, the first military vessel, to use electric lamps. Around the same time, American inventors William Sawyer and Albion Mann discovered that looping the light bulb filament helped it last longer and patented a bulb incorporating this improvement. However, the filament support in their design prevented the filament from expanding and contracting as it heated and cooled, making the bulb prone to cracking. Despite this, the Sawyer-Mann patent was to play a key role in the ensuing legal fight over who was the true inventor of the practical light bulb. And now at last we get to the man that you've all been waiting for, the Wizard of Menlo Park himself, Thomas Alva Edison. Edison's involvement in the light bulb story began in 1878, when he was trying to sell America on the idea of large-scale electrification. Unfortunately, while all sorts of useful electric devices had been invented by this time, from electric motors to electric stoves, outside of arc lamps, there was no real practical form of electrical illumination, meaning the home lighting market was dominated by gas lamps. In response, Edison publicly stated that he could create a safer, cheaper, and more reliable electric light to replace gas lights in only 6 weeks. Amazingly, such was Edison's clout at this time that his announcement caused gas company stocks to plummet. After raising funds from investors, Edison assembled a group of researchers he nicknamed his muckers at his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, and set to work. In December of 1879, Edison and his team demonstrated a practical light bulb using a thin platinum filament, which drew a much lower current than Joseph Swan's designs. However, the bulb lasted only 14 hours, and as noted, platinum was too expensive for a commercially viable bulb. So after patenting his design as improvement in electric lights on the 14th of October 1878, Edison and his muckers embarked on a marathon hunt for a light bulb filament that would be durable, long-lasting, and economical to manufacture. Much has been written about Edison's technical abilities compared to his contemporaries, especially rival Serbian inventor Nikola Tesla. But what Edison might have lacked in theoretical knowledge, he more than made up for with the realization that large-scale technical problems require large-scale solutions, an ethos that predicted today's era of big science and industrial research laboratories and inspired his famous motto, "Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration." Between 1878 and 1880, Edison and his team at Menlo Park tested over 6,000 filament materials, including cotton, linen, cedar, baywood, boxwood, and hickory. Edison even wrote botanists from around the world to obtain samples of exotic plants to test. At first, carbonized cotton seemed to hold the most promise, glowing for nearly 500 hours straight. Ultimately, however, Edison and his team hit upon carbonized bamboo, which allowed for bulbs to have lives of up to 1,200 hours. Of the entire research and development process, Edison later wrote, "The electric light has caused me the greatest amount of study and has required the most elaborate experiments." He continued, "I was never myself discouraged or inclined to be hopeless of success. I cannot say the same for all my associates." In 1880, Edison formed the Edison Illuminating Company to manufacture and market his new light bulbs. However, before he could patent his new developments, over in England, Joseph Swan used them to improve his own light bulb designs. Infuriated, Edison sued Swan for copyright infringement. Unfortunately for Edison, the courts ruled in favor of Swan, but also ruled that Edison's work was based on the prior art of William Sawyer and Albion Mann, remember them, who along with Hiram Maxim, inventor of the first modern machine gun by the way, formed the United States Electric Lighting Company in 1878. Edison's 1880 patents were thus nullified. In response, Edison joined forces with Joseph Swan to create the Edison-Swan United Electric Company, or Ediswan. This soon came to be one of the world's largest manufacturers of light bulbs. Finally, after nearly a decade of litigation, in 1889, the court reversed its decision, and Edison's 1880 patent claim for a filament of carbon of high resistance was ruled as valid. Over the following decades, Ediswan and its rivals would introduce dozens of key improvements to the basic light bulb design. The familiar 1-inch screw base and socket was patented by Edison in 1881 and introduced commercially in 1909 in General Electric's Mazda brand lamps. This design would soon become an industry standard worldwide. Indeed, before the widespread adoption of standard electrical plug outlets in the 1910s, early electrical appliances plugged directly into light bulb sockets. Edison also introduced new ways of heat-treating carbon filaments to make them last longer, as well as methods of improving the vacuum in the bulb. A major problem which plagued light bulb manufacturers during this era was air and moisture becoming absorbed into the glass during the manufacturing process, causing bulbs to split and burn out when switched on, a problem not even the most powerful vacuum pump could solve. In 1893, however, Italian inventor Arturo Malagnani discovered that if red phosphorus was introduced into the bulb, it acted as a getter, bonding with any remaining water and oxygen and preventing them from damaging the bulb or filament. In 1898, Edison purchased this patent, allowing him to increase the average life of his bulbs from 500 to 800 hours. Thus, Edison did not invent the light bulb in the traditional sense, rather he simply perfected the technology to the point where it became economically viable, and then he helped popularize it. As Robert Friedel, professor of history at the University of Maryland College Park, explains, he carefully identified all the key qualifications for a successful rival to the alternatives: reliability, longevity, economy, and aesthetics. He deliberately set out to create an electric light that would check all these boxes. This is something no one else succeeded in doing. But Edison did far more than just create a practical light bulb. He also created the entire electrical generating and distributing system, without which the light bulb would have been nothing but a curiosity. In September 1882, Edison opened the Pearl Street Generating Station in Lower Manhattan, the first commercial power plant of its kind. Prior to this, any home or business that wanted electric lighting needed to install its own dedicated generator. Edison's genius idea was imagining a larger commercial electric grid, which would not only make distribution more efficient, but also drive sales of electrical appliances like the light bulb. By the end of the century, the incandescent electric bulb had almost entirely replaced the gas lamp, just as Edison had intended. As Hughes P. Thomas writes in his book Technology at the Turning Point, the lamp was a small component in his system of electric lighting, and no more critical to its effective functioning than the Edison jumbo generator, the Edison main and feeder, and the parallel distribution system. Other inventors with generators and incandescent lamps, and with comparable ingenuity and excellence, have long been forgotten because their creators did not preside over their introduction in a system of lighting. The early 20th century brought further improvements to light bulb design, including the replacement of carbon filaments with a metal one. While Alexander Lodogin first patented the tungsten filament in the 1870s, it would be another 30 years before manufacturing technology made this material economical to work with. In the meantime, manufacturers experimented with various other metals, including osmium and tantalum. The first successful metal filament lamp using osmium was developed in 1898 by Austrian inventor Karl Auer von Welsbach and sold under various names, including Osmi and Ordos. However, the osmium was so expensive that the bulbs were not sold, but rather rented, with the consumer trading in the bulbs for partial credit when they burned out. Due to this flaw and competition from other cheaper bulbs, osmium bulbs were discontinued in 1905. In 1902, German firm Siemens introduced tantalum filament lamps, which were not only brighter and longer lasting than carbon filament lamps, but cheaper than osmium lamps as well. The filaments also had the useful property of welding itself back together again if it broke, though this gradually reduced the filament's resistance and thus its brightness. In the end, however, tungsten proved to be the superior material, with the first tungsten filament light bulbs being introduced in 1904 by the Hungarian company Tungsram. In 1913, Tungsram introduced another key innovation, replacing the vacuum with an inert gas like argon. This allowed the filament to glow brighter with less current and slowed its evaporation, increasing efficiency and bulb lifespan. Other innovations included the ductile tungsten filament, patented in 1906 by William Coolidge at General Electric, the coiled tungsten filament, first mass-produced by Japanese firm Hanotsuka, better known today as Toshiba, in 1936, and the frosted bulb developed by Marvin Pipkin in 1925. These innovations, along with the ongoing electrification of cities around the world, caused sales of light bulbs to skyrocket. Between 1914 and 1945, light bulb consumption in the United States alone grew from 88.5 million to 795 million, more than 5 lamps per person per year. The longevity of light bulbs also reached truly impressive heights. One bulb at Fire Station No. 6 in Livermore, California, has been burning almost continuously since it was first installed in 1901, earning it a place in the Guinness Book of World Records. In fact, light bulb lifespans became so good that they began cutting into manufacturers' bottom line as the market became saturated and people stopped buying bulbs. In response, in 1924, a group of light bulb manufacturers based in Geneva formed the Phoebus Cartel, which limited the maximum lifespan of its members' bulbs to 1,000 hours, partially in order to maintain steady sales. This was one of the first deliberate applications of the now common tactic of planned obsolescence. Over the course of the 20th century, inventors would come up with a wide variety of new and improved electric light sources, from mercury and sodium vapor lamps to halogen bulbs, neon lights, fluorescent lights, and finally light-emitting diodes or LEDs. But with the possible exception of LEDs, none of these inventions has had an outsized an impact on our modern world as the original incandescent light bulb, which finally brought cheap, reliable electric lighting into businesses and homes and allowed commerce and leisure to carry on 24/7. But as with so many key technological developments, this illumination revolution was not the product of a single inspired light bulb moment, but rather many of them.
Imagine for a moment that you've come across someone lying unconscious on the ground. They aren't breathing and they have no pulse. Do you know what to do? If you're taking a first aid course, then you probably know the following steps by heart. Call 911 or ask a bystander to do so for you. Place the victim on their back on a firm surface. Kneel next to the victim's neck and shoulders. Place the heel of one hand on their chest between the nipples and the other hand on top of the first. With your elbows locked and using your body weight, compress the victim's chest at least 2 inches or 5 centimeters at 100 to 120 compressions per minute, roughly the same as the rhythm of staying alive or another one bites the dust. Don't worry if you hear a crunch. Broken ribs are better than death. After 30 chest compressions, perform rescue breathing. Tilt the victim's head back with one hand while lifting their chin with the other to open the airway. Pinch the victim's nose shut, place your lips over theirs to form a seal, and breathe out, watching the victim's chest to make sure it rises. If you have a protective rescue breathing barrier or mask, use it. If the victim's mouth is too badly injured to form a seal, breathe through their nose. Deliver 2 rescue breaths, then resume chest compressions. Continue alternating between 30 compressions and 2 breaths until medical help arrives. If you're too tired to continue, ask someone else to take over. While there is significant research indicating that for non-emergency responders without any of the tools these individuals have, it's actually much better to just do compressions, for reasons we'll get into in the bonus facts later. For now, these are the official American Heart Association instructions for cardiopulmonary resuscitation, better known as CPR, a procedure that helps save the lives of an estimated 100,000 people every year. But while CPR might seem like a straightforward and intuitive process that has been around forever, in reality its modern form only dates to the 1960s. Prior to this, doctors promoted all sorts of elaborate, questionable, and downright bizarre techniques for reviving victims of drowning, suffocation, cardiac arrest, and other medical emergencies, including quite literally blowing smoke up people's bottoms. So take a deep breath and tone up your arms as we dive into the long and convoluted history of CPR. Surprisingly, modern resuscitation techniques have existed since the dawn of human civilization. The ancient Hindu Rig Veda and ancient Egyptian Ebers Papyrus, both written in the 2nd millennium BCE, describe the process of tracheostomy, in which an incision is made in the throat and a hollow reed is inserted to bypass a blocked airway. An early form of rescue breathing is also apparently performed by the prophet Elijah in the Old Testament. Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sound or response. So Gehazi went back to meet Elisha and told him the boy has not awakened. When Elisha reached the house, there was the boy lying dead on his couch. He went in, shut the door on the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and lay on the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. As he stretched himself out on him, the boy's body grew warm. Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room, and then got on the bed and stretched out on him once more. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Descriptions of rescue breathing combined with chest compressions appear in ancient Greece, ancient Roman, and medieval European and Middle Eastern medical texts, with one of the most advanced techniques, which involve moving the victim's arms to expand the lungs and compressing the left side of their chest, being developed by 15th century Persian physician Burhan-ud-Din Kamani. However, none of these techniques were widely endorsed by mainstream physicians and were mostly used by lay healers and midwives. The following centuries, however, saw an explosion of weird and wonderful techniques for reviving victims of drowning, suffocation, and hypothermia. With little understanding of how respiration or even blood circulation worked, doctors instead focused on shocking unconscious bodies back to life. This was accomplished by flagellating victims with whips, wet cloths, or even stinging nettles, pouring hot water, embers, or burning dry excrement on their bodies, hanging them upside down or placing them on the back of a trotting horse, bloodletting, and even, as previously alluded to, tobacco smoke enemas, which unfortunately is exactly what it sounds like. Indeed, by the 1780s, the British Society for the Recovery of Persons Apparently Drowned, later the Royal Humane Society, installed resuscitation kits containing tobacco enema equipment at various points along the River Thames to revive victims of drowning, and for more on this absurd practice, please do check out our previous video when doctors literally blew smoke up your ass. Thankfully for all of us today, starting in the 16th century, doctors began to better understand how the body works, laying the groundwork for future, more successful resuscitation methods. Contemporary techniques, however, remained as questionable as ever. For example, in the 1530s, Swiss physician Theophrastus von Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus, advocated the Bellows method, which involved inserting an ordinary fireplace bellows into a victim's nostril and using it to pump air into their lungs. This not only did little to revive the victim, but could actually inflict further damage by overinflating the lungs lungs and filling them with ashen cinders. It's worth noting here that in Paracelsus's time, doctors believed that it was merely the motion of the lungs which kept people alive. It was not until 1667 that English polymath Robert Hooke postulated that it was actually the continuous supply of fresh air that was vital to life, a fact he demonstrated by cutting open a dog and keeping it alive by pumping air in and out of its lungs. 6 decades later, in 1732, a Scottish surgeon named William Tosser successfully used mouth-to-mouth rescue breathing to revive a suffocated coal miner. Not only was this the first recorded use of this technique in the modern medical literature, but it also practically demonstrated that exhaled breath contains enough oxygen to support life. Indeed, we now know that while ordinary air at sea level contains around 21% oxygen, not all of this is absorbed by the lungs, meaning that exhaled breath contains around 13% oxygen, along with 78% nitrogen and 9% carbon dioxide and other trace gases. Shortly after Tosser's discovery, the French Academy of Sciences in Paris made mouth-to-mouth resuscitation its official recommended technique for reviving drowning victims. However, in a move likely inspired by Anglo-French rivalry rather than sound scientific judgment, the Royal Humane Society rejected this recommendation and instead promoted the use of Bellows, which, along with tobacco smoke, enema gear, were included in resuscitation kits installed along the Thames. The accidental inflation of the stomach by the bellows was at first prevented by applying pressure to the esophagus, while in 1788 physician Charles Kite developed the procedure of endotracheal intubation, the insertion of a tube directly into the trachea. This technique is still used today. Meanwhile, doctors and inventors across the British Isles introduced a variety of alternative resuscitation techniques, including the inversion method, which involved hanging the victim upside down from a block and tackle and repeatedly raising and lowering them, and the barrel method, in which the victim was draped over a barrel and rolled back and forth. While seemingly as absurd as earlier techniques like flagellation or the trotting horse, they worked on the sound principle of expanding and compressing the chest to expel water and stimulate breathing. The next major move toward the standardization of resuscitation techniques came in August 1767 with the establishment of the Society and Recovery of Drowned Persons in Amsterdam, a city of canals and cold winters that suffered hundreds of cases of drowning and hypothermia every year. In its first year of operation, the society saved 150 people, inspiring the formation of similar organizations in Hamburg, Venice, Milan, Padua, Vienna, Paris, and other cities. In Hamburg in 1769, an ordinance was passed allowing notices to be read in churches describing standard techniques for resuscitating people who were drowned, strangled, suffocated, and frozen. Among these techniques was artificial respiration, which proved so effective that in a stunning reversal of opinion, it soon prompted the British Royal Humane Society to declare its long-preferred revival instrument, the bellows, quote, a lethal weapon which should be relegated to its former place by the fireside. By the 1820s, however, the Society had again abandoned artificial respiration, this time in favor of chest compressions. Their logic was that artificial respiration risked overinflating the victim's lungs, while the fresh air inspired via chest compressions was superior to expired air, which was depleted of oxygen. In 1868, Dr. John Hill of the Royal Free Hospital in London described a widely used method nearly identical to today's CPR techniques. The surgeon's left hand was placed firmly across the front of the chest, the fingers resting over the 5th, 6th, and 7th costal cartilages on the right side, while the tip of the thumb lay on the second piece of the sternum and the muscular part of the hand on the corresponding cartilages on the left side. The right hand was now crossed over the left, and forcible pressure made, the hands then being suddenly removed, the chest was allowed to expand by its own elasticity. Soon, however, other doctors developed a host of alternative methods for achieving the same ventilation effect. The technique developed by London physician Marshall Hall in 1856, for example, involved alternately repositioning the victim from face up to their side, while that developed by Henry Sylvester in 1858 involved alternately stretching the patient's arm over their head and crossing them over their chest to expand and compress the lungs. Yet another technique, the Dalrymple method, involved passing a cloth beneath the victim, crossing it over their chest, and having two people pull alternately on each end. Of these, the Sylvester method proved surprisingly long-lived, with a refined version known as the Holger-Nielsen method being used well into the 1950s. Now, so far, we have only looked at one half of the CPR equation, getting fresh air into the victim's lungs and bloodstream. The other goal of the CPR practitioner is to manually pump the victim's heart in order to circulate that absorbed oxygen to vital areas of the body, particularly the brain. The development of such techniques depended on scientists and doctors gaining an accurate understanding of how the heart and blood circulation worked, an understanding first pioneered by English physician William Harvey. In 1628, Harvey published the landmark volume An Anatomical Exercise on the Motion of the Heart and Blood in Living Beings, in which he described for the first time how blood flows from the heart through arteries to every corner of the body before being returned to the heart via the veins. In that same year, he described the following experiment conducted on a dissected dove. Quote, After the heart had quite left motion, and the ear's arterial appendages had quite given over, I wetted my finger with spittle, and being warmed, kept it a while on the heart. The heart and its ears began to contract, and did seem as if it were recalled back again from death." End quote. This remarkable result suggested that a stopped heart could be restarted by manual manipulation, what is now known by surgeons as cardiac massage. However, it would not be until the 1870s, after the development of general anesthesia and sterile surgical methods, that cardiac massage would successfully be used in surgery. In 1874, Moritz Schiff, a professor of physiology working in Florence, Italy, was studying the causes of cardiac arrest in surgical patients anesthetized with chloroform and ether using dogs as test subjects. Noting that in these cases, cardiac arrest usually preceded respiratory arrest, Moritz realized that the regular resuscitation methods of artificial ventilation or chest compressions would be useless. Instead, he discovered that, quote, "if one opens the thorax whilst air is slowly blown into the lungs and compresses the heart rhythmically with the hand to squeeze out the blood, compressing the abdominal aorta at the same time so that more of the artificial circulation is directed to the head, one can restore the heart as long as 11.5 minutes after it has been arrested." End quote. At a stroke, Schiff had demonstrated that cardiac massage worked not only through directly stimulating the heart, but also by restoring the flow of oxygenated blood to the cardiac muscle, allowing it to resume its regular function. 3 decades later, in 1901, Norwegian surgeon Dr. Christian Ilgesrud was performing an abdominal surgery when his patient's heart suddenly stopped. Working quickly, Ilgesrud cut away part of the patient's 4th and 5th ribs, reached into the thoracic cavity, and massaged the heart until it restarted. The patient went on to make a complete recovery. By 1909, nearly 50 successful uses of internal cardiac massage have been reported, while by 1952 a successful rate of nearly 33% have been achieved, earning the practice a place in the pantheon of standard surgical techniques. Even if the patient's chest was not already open, cardiac massage could be carried out without cutting any ribs away by making an incision in the abdomen and reaching up below the rib cage into the thoracic cavity. At the same time, surgeons were beginning to discover that external chest compressions could be just as effective at maintaining circulation and restoring cardiac function as invasive cardiac massage. In 1878, for example, German surgeon Dr. Rudolf Bohm successfully used this technique to maintain blood circulation in cats, while in 1891 and 1903, fellow German Dr. Friedrich Maas and American surgeon Dr. George Creel reported the first successful resuscitations of patients via external chest compressions. However, these findings were largely ignored, with internal heart massage remaining the preferred technique until the 1960s. While this failure to adopt the newer, less invasive technique was partially due to poor communication between cardiac experts, it was also a product of professional propriety, with surgeons fearing that external chest compressions, which could theoretically be performed by anyone, would undermine their own medical value. To combat the first obstacle, in 1924, 6 cardiologists met in Chicago to form the American Heart Organization, an organization dedicated to collecting and disseminating new research on cardiac health through conferences and its official journal Circulation, which was first published in 1950. This period also saw significant progress in the development of emergency resuscitation techniques that could be performed by the average citizen. By 1946, Minnesota physician James Ellen performed artificial respiration on a child afflicted with polio, which in extreme cases paralyzes the diaphragm and leads to respiratory arrest. As Ellen later recalled, "I sealed my lips around his nose and his lungs inflated. In 4 breaths, he was pink." 10 years later, Austrian physicist Peter Safar built upon Ellen's methods, perfecting a technique which came to be known as rescue breathing. In 1957, rescue breathing was officially adopted by the US Army to resuscitate victims of cardiac arrest and other medical emergencies. CPR, as we know it today, however, was the brainchild of American electrical engineer and medical researcher William Cohen-Hoven, who also invented another key piece of resuscitation technology, the defibrillator. As previously covered in our video, Hollywood Myths, How Doctors Actually Resuscitate Someone, Cohen-Hoven joined the staff of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in 1914, and in 1928 began studying the use of electricity to reset hearts afflicted by fibrillation, random uncoordinated contraction that prevents blood from being effectively pumped. In the course of this research, he discovered that adequate circulation could be maintained in even a fibrillating heart for up to 30 minutes through the application of external chest compressions. In 1960, at a meeting of the Maryland Medical Society, Cohen-Hoven announced that he had achieved a survival rate of 70% in 20 patients. evidence, demonstrating that the average citizen could effectively respond to a cardiac emergency outside a hospital environment without the need for special medical equipment. Peter Zavar, who was also at the conference, combined Cohen-Oven's methods with his own rescue breathing technique to create modern cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or CPR. That same year, Safar Elam, Dr. Archer Gordon, and Norwegian toy maker Asmund Leerdal created Resusciani. This was a life-size training mannequin still used today to teach basic CPR skills to millions of people worldwide. In 1962, Safar, along with doctors Guy Knickerbocker and James Jude, embarked on a global tour to promote the new technique, even producing a training film titled The Pulse of Life, which introduced the now familiar mnemonic ABC for the key components of CPR: airway, breathing, and circulation. In 1963, the American Heart Association officially endorsed CPR, while in 1966 a national conference was created to officially standardize the technique. But while CPR is now taught in first aid courses all around the world, it is important to point out that it is not the magical resuscitation technique depicted in many movies and TV shows, in which a handful of breaths and chest compressions are all it takes to immediately bring a victim back to life. Rather, the main purpose of CPR is to maintain blood and oxygen flow to a victim's brain, thus preventing permanent damage until they can receive proper medical attention. If performed promptly and correctly, CPR can double or even triple a heart attack or cardiac arrest patient's chances of survival. However, even these improved odds are disturbingly low. According to a 2010 meta-study, the average survival rate for out-of-hospital cardiac arrests without immediate intervention is only 7.6%, while the rate for in-hospital arrests is only slightly better at 17%, and these statistics only apply to younger, healthier patients. The odds drop to 6.7% for patients in their 70s and 2.4% for those over 90, while the long-term survival rate after resuscitation for those with cancer or heart, lung, and liver disease is an abysmal 2%. Still, a slim chance is better than no chance at all, so if you haven't already, maybe go out and get your CPR certification. It may just save someone's life. Bonus fact. In 2010, ILCOR, the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation, reviewed hundreds of studies and found that breathing just wasn't necessary for people when doing CPR, even for advanced medical personnel like paramedics and doctors. They also found checking for a pulse wasn't as important as once thought. Instead, the layperson just needed to know two things in these circumstances. Is the person unconscious, and are they breathing normally? If not, start CPR. All a person needs to know in this case is how to perform compressions. The extreme shift from a layperson not needing to necessarily give breaths and not checking for pulses might on the surface seem strange. After all, brain cells obviously need oxygen to maintain aerobic metabolism, so why not breathe for them? What ILCOR found was that at the moment someone goes into cardiac arrest, the brain is still trying to function, only with a less than adequate oxygen supply. The breathing centers of the brain, specifically the medulla oblongata and the pons region, continue to send signals to the diaphragm in an attempt to keep respiration going. The end result is a breathing rate known as agonal respiration. While this type of breathing isn't sufficient to maintain appropriate oxygen levels in someone's blood for long, it still allows for some exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide within the lungs. At the moment of cardiac arrest, there is also an adequate amount of oxygen in the blood to maintain metabolism within the brain for a few minutes. A person's metabolism will naturally use up this available oxygen over time, but combined with agonal respiration, the result is that there can be enough oxygen within the bloodstream that breathing isn't necessary. Unfortunately, the exact amount of time where breathing isn't necessary isn't precisely known, varying from study to study. However, ILCOR looked at studies using different ventilation to compression ratios from 15 compressions to 2 breaths, all the way up to 100 compressions to 1 breath, and even no breathing and only compressions. While every study had differing numbers of survival, the trend was always the same. The least amount of interruption in compressions, even for breathing, the better chance the person had of surviving.
Every hero needs his trusty sidekick. After all, where would Batman be without Robin, Holmes without Watson, Frodo without Sam, or Han without Chewbacca? In real life, however, sidekicks seldom get top billing no matter how vital their contributions, and even when their names are widely known, their lives and accomplishments are often overlooked next to those of their more illustrious colleagues. Most pertinent to the topic at hand today, on March the 10th, 1876, history was forever changed when inventor Alexander Graham Bell, working in a drafty loft in Boston, spoke the immortal words, "Mr. Watson, come here, I need to see you." To his joy, the Watson in question, his assistant Thomas A. Watson, rushed up from the floor below, having heard Bell's words clearly over the newfangled electrical device the pair were tinkering with. Bell and Watson had just proven the viability of the telephone, an invention that would revolutionize global communications. But Thomas Watson was far more than the recipient of history's first telephone call. An accomplished inventor and industrialist in his own right, he was responsible for many innovations that made the telephone a practical communications technology, and used his telephone royalties to found one of America's greatest shipyards, which helped make the US a global naval superpower. This is the story of history's other greatest forgotten sidekick with the surname Watson. Thomas Augustus Watson was born on January 18, 1854 in Salem, Massachusetts. The son of a livery stable owner, at the age of 13 he dropped out of school to enter the workforce, a formative experience he later came to look upon fondly. As he stated in a 1913 speech, "I realize now what a lucky boy I was when at 13 years of age I had to leave school and go to work for my living, although I didn't think so at the time. I am not advising my young friends to leave school at this age, for they may not have the opportunity to enter college as I did at 40. After trying several vocations, clerking, bookkeeping, carpentering, etc., and finding them all unattractive, I at last found just the job that suited me in the electrical workshop of Charles Williams at 109 Court Street, Boston, one of the best men I have ever known." Watson was immediately put to work at $5 a week machining binding posts for electrical equipment. It was tedious and exacting work, and often hazardous, as Watson would later recall. "The mechanics of today with their automatic screw machines hardly know what it is to turn little rough castings with a hand tool. How the hot chips used to fly into our eyes. One day I had a fine idea. I bought a pair of 25-cent goggles, thinking the others would hail me as the benefactor of mankind and adopt my plan. But they laughed at me for being such a sissy boy, and public opinion forced me back to the old-time honored plan of winking when I saw a chip coming. It was not an efficient plan, for the chip usually got there first." Despite these challenges, Watson thrived in Williams's shop and was quickly promoted to machining all manner of complex parts, particularly keys, bells, armatures, and other components for telegraphs. Williams encouraged his workers to tinker when business was slow, and Watson took this opportunity to design and build himself a small working steam engine. This engine, Watson later claimed, planted the seeds of his later industrial endeavors. But in the end, Watson's fortunes would come by way of the shop's more unusual customers. He states, "Besides the regular work at Williams, there was a constant stream of wild-eyed inventors with big ideas in their heads and little money in their pockets, coming to the shop to have their ideas tried out in brass and iron. Most of them had an angel whom they had hypnotized into paying the bills. My enthusiasm, and perhaps my sympathetic nature, made me a favorite workman with those men of visions, and in 1873 to 1874, my work had become largely making experimental apparatuses for such men. Few of their ideas ever amounted to anything, but I liked to do the work as it kept me roaming in fresh fields and pastures new all the time. Had it not been, however, for my youthful enthusiasm, always one of my chief assets, I fear this experience would have made me so skeptical and cynical as to the value of electrical inventions that my future prospects might have been injured." In 1875, Watson's skills brought him to the attention of Alexander Graham Bell, a Scottish-born inventor and speech instructor at the Boston School for Deaf Mutes. At this point, Bell was not yet working on the telephone. Instead, he was attempting to develop a harmonic telegraph which would send multiple messages over a single wire. The year before, inventor Thomas Edison had developed a quadruplex telegraph and sold it to the Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company, giving them an enormous advantage over their main rival, Western Union. However, as telegraph traffic across the United States continued to increase, even quadruplex telegraphs soon became overwhelmed, creating demand for systems that could multiplex an even greater number of signals. Bell's idea was to send each signal at a different frequency, generated by vibrating electromagnet-driven reed. At the other end of the line, only a receiver tuned to the same frequency as a particular transmitter would receive that particular signal, meaning an effectively unlimited number of signals could be sent over the same line. Bell's research was funded by his future father-in-law, lawyer and financier Gardner Green Hubbard. At first, Bell merely tasked Watson with manufacturing components for his telegraph prototypes, but later he hired him as his full-time assistant, the pair working out of Bell's laboratory in the attic of his boarding house at 5 Exeter Place. They mostly worked in the evenings after Bell had finished work at the Boston school. Shortly after forming his partnership, Bell revealed to Watson a new idea he had been pondering. I listened, I suspected somewhat languidly, for I must have been working that day about 16 hours with only a short nutritive interval, and Bell had already given me, during the weeks we had worked together, more new ideas on a great variety of subjects, including visible speech, elocution, and flying machines than my brain could assimilate. But when he went on to say that he had an idea by which he believed it would be possible to talk by telegraph, my nervous system got such a shock that the tired feeling vanished. I have never forgotten his exact words. They have run in my mind ever since like a mathematical formula. If, he said, I could make a current of electricity vary in intensity precisely as the air varies in density during the production of a sound, I should be able to transmit speech telegraphically. He then sketched for me an instrument that he thought would do this, and we discussed the possibility of constructing one. I did not make it was altogether too costly, and the chances of it working too uncertain to impress his financial backers, Mr. Gardner G. Hubbard and Mr. Thomas Sanders, who were insisting that the wisest thing for Bell to do was to perfect the harmonic telegraph. Then he would have money and leisure enough to build air castles like the telephone. Unfortunately, the harmonic telegraph proved a tougher problem to crack than expected, and more than a year passed during which the pair made scarcely any progress. Ironically, however, it was the temperamental harmonic telegraph which led directly to Bell and Watson's greatest discovery. As Watson later recalled, on the afternoon of June 2nd, 1875, we were hard at work on the same old job, testing some modification of the instruments. I had charge of the transmitters as usual, setting them squealing one after the other, while Bell was returning the receiver springs one by one, pressing them against his ear as I have described. One of the transmitter springs I was attending to stopped vibrating, and I plucked it to start it again. It didn't start, and I kept on plucking it, when suddenly I heard a shout from Bell in the next room, and then out he came with a rush, demanding, "What did you do then? Don't change anything, let me see." I showed him it was very simple. The contact screw was screwed down so far that it made permanent contact with the spring, so that when I snapped the spring, the circuit had remained unbroken while the strip of magnetized steel, by its vibration over the pole of its magnet, was generating that marvelous conception of Bell's, a current of electricity that varied in intensity precisely as the air was varying in density within hearing distance of that spring. That undulating current had passed through the connecting wire to the distant receiver, which, fortunately, was a mechanism that could transform the current back into an extremely faint echo of the sound of the vibrating spring that had generated it. But what was still more fortunate, the right man had that mechanism at his ear during that fleeting moment, and instantly recognized the transcendent importance of that faint sound thus electrically transmitted. The speaking telephone was born at that moment. Bell knew perfectly well that the mechanism that could transmit all the complex vibrations of one sound could do the same for any sound, even that of speech. Seizing upon this breakthrough, Bell and Watson immediately constructed a prototype which they called the gallows telephone, consisting of a thin membrane or diaphragm connected to a magnet sliding inside a coil of wire. Sound would induce vibrations in the diaphragm and magnet, causing the coil to generate a varying electrical current. This current would then be converted back into sound by an identical device at the other end of the transmission line. Unfortunately, the device was not sensitive enough to pick up the nuances of the human voice and transmitted only vague, incomprehensible noises. But Bell and Watson knew they were on the right track. And after another year of experimentation, they came up with a new design working on a different principle. Known as the liquid transmitter, this device replaced the magnet and coil with a needle attached to the diaphragm on one end and immersed in a container of sulfuric acid on the other. Current from the battery was passed from the needle through the acid to an electrode below, with the whole circuit being connected by a wire to an electromagnetic receiver installed in the cellar of the boarding house. When the diaphragm vibrated, so did the needle in the acid, varying the resistance of the circuit and the current in the wire. This system was much more sensitive and produced a more powerful signal than the gallows telephone, which was limited by the relatively low amount of mechanical energy generated by the human voice. However, before they could construct this new model, Bell and Watson learned that a rival inventor, Elisha Gray, was very close to perfecting his own telephone. Bell thus rushed to the patent office without even having a working prototype, narrowly beating Gray to the punch. Bell's master patent for the telephone was thus issued on March 7, 1876. 3 days later, Bell and Watson made history. As the story goes, that afternoon, Bell was working on the transmitter in the attic while Watson made adjustments to the receiver in the cellar below. At some point, Bell accidentally spilled some acid from the transmitter onto himself and in frustration uttered those immortal words, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." Sometimes recorded as "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Whatever the exact words, down in the cellar, Watson was shocked to hear Bell's words coming clearly through the receiver and rushed upstairs to answer his employer's summons. Quite by accident, the pair had conducted history's first phone call. From this breakthrough moment, progress was very swift. On June the 25th of that year, Bell demonstrated the telephone before stunned crowds at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, while on October the 9th, he and Watson succeeded in holding a conversation over a 2-mile telephone line strung between Boston and Cambridge. And so it was that in 1877, Bell formed the Bell Telephone Company, while in 1878, the first commercial telephone exchange was installed in New Haven, Connecticut. The new technology spread quickly around the world, making Bell and Watson very wealthy men. But Thomas Watson's role in the telephone story did not end with manufacturing the first prototypes. Though he and Bell had created a machine capable of transmitting the human voice over long distances, as a practical appliance it still had many shortcomings. As Watson later wrote, "It began to dawn on us that people engaged in getting their living in the ordinary walks of life couldn't be expected to keep the telephone at their ear all the time waiting for a call. So it devolved on me to get up some sort of a call signal. Williams, on his line, used to call by thumping the diaphragm through the mouthpiece with the butt of a lead pencil. If there was someone close to the telephone at the other end, and it was very still, it did pretty well, but it seriously damaged the vitals of the machine. And besides, we might have to supply a pencil with every telephone, and that would be expensive. Then I rigged a little hammer inside the box with a button on the outside. When the button was thumped, the hammer would hit the side of the diaphragm where it could not be damaged. The usual electrical transformation took place, and a much more modest, but still unmistakable thump would issue from the telephone at the other end. That was the first calling apparatus ever devised for use with the telephone. But the exacting public wanted something better, and I devised the Watson buzzer, the only practical use we ever made of the harmonic telegraph relics. It was a vast improvement on the Watson thumper, but still it didn't take the popular fancy. It brought me only a fleeting fame, for I soon superseded it by a magneto-electric call bell that solved the problem, and was destined to make a long-suffering public turn cranks for the next 15 years or so, as it never had before or ever will hereafter. In the end, Watson would be awarded a total of 35 patents for various improvements to the telephone, including buzzers and bells, an automatic switch to cut off the line when the receiver was hung up, and pieces of switchboard equipment. These inventions helped the Bell Telephone Company dominate the fledgling market for decades to come. By 1881, however, Watson had grown tired of the telephone business and resigned as general inspector of Bell Telephone to pursue his own interests. After taking an extended vacation in Europe and marrying his fiancée Elizabeth, Watson returned to the United States and purchased a 60-acre farm near the Fore River in East Braintree, Massachusetts. When the farm proved a failure, he decided to resurrect an old project, the steam engine he had built while working at Charles Williams' machine shop. Together with mechanic L.J. Wing, Watson spent a year trying to perfect and market the engine he had built, but failed to find any backers. In 1885, however, he partnered with engineer and businessman Frank Wellington to found the Fore River Ship and Engine Company. Following the completion of the company's first ship, the Barnacle, Watson and Wellington began receiving a steady string of orders for their high-quality steam engines, commercial vessels of all types, and various pieces of industrial machinery, such as printing presses and electrical lighting equipment. Then, in 1896, they were contracted by the United States Navy to construct 2 Lawrence-class destroyers, the USS Lawrence and the USS McDonough. Soon, demand grew so high that in 1901, the company was forced to open a new shipyard at a site further downriver at Quincy Point. The new yard allowed the company to take on even larger projects, including the Virginia-class battleships USS New Jersey and USS Rhode Island, and the 7-masted steel-hulled schooner Thomas W. Lawson. The yard also produced ships for foreign clients, including the first 5 submarines for the Imperial Japanese Navy and the battleship ARA Rivadavia for the Argentine Navy. After being purchased by Bethlehem Steel in 1913, the company opened yet another shipyard at Squantum Point, which during the First World War produced 71 destroyers for the U.S. Navy, more than any other American shipyard. Over the next 7 decades, the yard would go from strength to strength, producing hundreds of civilian and military vessels through the end of the Second World War and beyond. One of the shipyard's strangest claim to fame was being the birthplace of a popular 1940s soldier meme, Kilroy was here, and for more on this strange phenomenon, please do go check out our previous video, Kilroy was here, the story behind one of the first viral memes in modern history. In any event, one of the most successful shipyards in American history, Fort River would remain in service for just over a century, finally closing its doors on June 1st, 1986. But going back to Watson, restless as ever, eventually he grew tired of the shipbuilding business and in 1904 sold his shares in the company. An inveterate dabbler, he served for a time as state treasurer of Massachusetts and then as a paleontologist, having previously completed a 3-year degree in the subject along with his wife. Working with MIT professor William Otis Crosby, Watson participated in geological and paleontological surveys of Boston Basin, even managing to discover a genus of extinct snail that now bears his name, Watsonella. He later traveled to California and Alaska to prospect for gold deposits and completed his long-delayed education by obtaining a Master of Arts from Union College in 1919 and a Doctorate of Engineering from the Stevens Institute of Technology in 1921. Yet even geology and engineering could not satisfy Watson's wandering fancy, and in 1910 he reinvented himself again by joining a touring Shakespearean theater troupe and giving performances across Europe and the United States. But despite his efforts to distance himself from his most famous invention, the telephone remained a constant presence in Watson's life. On January 25th, 1915, he participated in history's first transcontinental telephone call placed between New York and San Francisco. On the other end of the line was none other than his old partner, Alexander Graham Bell. And in his final years, Watson spent his time between theater performances and paleontology seminars, as well as giving lectures on the telephone and the pivotal role he played in its development. In the end, Thomas Augustus Watson died of heart disease on December 13th, 1934 in Paso Grill, Florida at the age of 80. He was buried in his family plot in North Weymouth, Massachusetts, overlooking the former Fore River shipyard, which he considered his greatest achievement. Far more than a mere sidekick, Watson was a dynamic and passionate individual in his own right, using the freedom afforded by his great wealth to pursue his various passions with maximum gusto. Or, as Watson himself would put it, each science is the study of a way in which the infinite energy expresses itself in the universe, and every attainment one makes in such knowledge carries him a little deeper into the divine mystery. Surely no other justification is needed for such studies.